Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into an absolutely captivating manhwa story, where the line between a fake marriage and real love becomes impossibly blurred. Picture this, you're an ordinary girl who suddenly wakes up as a minor character in a novel you just finished reading. Your family's drowning in debt, the future looks bleak. But then a missing child poster with 100 million reward literally flies into your face like a gift from heaven. Victoria seized that chance, rescued little Leon, and thought everything would wrap up neatly. But fate had other plans. She found herself in a bizarre contract marriage with Duke Chester Halos, the coldest, most intimidating man in the entire empire. 1 year as his fake wife in exchange for 1 billion sounds like the perfect deal, right? But here's the thing. Can hearts really follow a contract? What starts as a simple transaction spirals into something far more complicated. Between a traumatized child who desperately needs love, a duke with hidden wounds from his past, and a girl trying to change her destiny, this story will take you on an emotional roller coaster you won't see coming. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's turn the pages of this heart-wrenching tale together. The church's ceremonial hall is lavishly decorated. Next to the altar is Duke Chester Halos and Victoria Leon, who is beside the bride. Nor was she rude or angry like she used to be before from the reaction of Victoria's parents. Elsa realized how poorly she behaved. Because she couldn't leave him in the castle with strangers, the Duke who was watching them. Crossing his arms, Aiden declared that his family wasn't that rich, and that they didn't need the Duke Chester's donations. He tried to explain that by giving them those diamonds, he didn't want to imply that, but the guy interrupted him and said he didn't think of selling his daughter for some stones. Chester swallowed nervously. His whole body was shaking and covered in sweat. He couldn't understand what he had done to be seen so poorly by the guy's family, and if he had known earlier, he would have asked Ron to take care of a good gift, regaining composure and not wanting to give up so easily. He asked Victoria's father what he would like to receive from him as a gift in that case, but in response, Aiden asked him to take the box and leave his house. Noticing how the Duke was getting discouraged, Victoria realized that he wasn't exactly a master of persuasion. Looking at him, she understood she needed to help Chester before he got kicked out for good. The girl hurried to assure her parents that the Duke wasn't someone disrespectful. He was just trying to make a good impression. Noticing that Chester wasn't doing anything to play along, the girl placed her hand over his. Her heart started beating fast. Was completely sure that if he kept pressuring the girl, her deception would soon be uncovered. And accepting his word, she squeezed his hand between hers. She didn't understand why he held her so tightly, or why he had such a strange expression on his face. Rosalie looked surprised at the Duke's and Victoria's hands, while the guy was beside himself with rage. Seeing the girl's hand trapped in his, the Duke smiled embarrassed and turned as red as a tomato. Noticing this, the Baroness also smiled and asked Victoria to step out of the room for a moment. Rosalie explained to her daughter that they needed to talk to the Duke, but the girl was afraid to leave them alone, thinking Chester might say anything stupid. However, the Duke, now calmer, he convinced Victoria that everything was fine and asked her not to worry about him. Victoria bowed and left, and Rosalie asked her husband not to be so harsh and that they all talk calmly. The woman sat Aiden next to her, and he, with a serious face, asked the Duke why he and Victoria had decided to get married. Chester understood that they were being given a chance, and that meant that it wasn't all lost yet. Straightening up and sitting properly, he told them firmly, to the girls' parents, that he loved their daughter. The guy wanted to know how long it had been since they confessed their feelings. After thinking it over a bit, Chester proposed to Victoria to stay that month in the mansion with the kid. And when it all started thoughtful, the Duke admitted that at first he didn't like Victoria. Since there were unpleasant rumors about her, he believed them judged the girl, and really came to doubt her. However, the more he got to know her, the more he realized that the rumors were false. Chester found out she was a strong person, but sincere and loving. The Duke confessed that she was very different from him, someone strict with others and loyal to his principles. He told Victoria's parents how something clicked inside him, and he fell in love with the girl, on the faces of Aiden and Rosalie. It was clear that the Duke's story had moved them. However, the guy still thought that getting married was a decision too, rushed and impulsive since they were both very young. Chester apologized for his selfishness, pointing out that Victoria was the only one who really made him want to be her husband. Upon hearing this, Rosalie smiled, remembering how she and the guy also got married just 2 months after meeting. She nostalgically recalled that back then. Everyone was against it, but she and Aiden didn't care. The woman expressed her hope that the Duke, a servant named Ron, accompanied the girl and Leon to the rooms assigned to them, and Victoria felt the same. Meanwhile, the girl walked back and forth in the hallway, in front of the door, thinking about what was happening in the room and very worried. Seeing the Duke come out of the room, she ran toward him to find out what her parents had said. He leaned toward her to whisper the answer in her ear, and Victoria waited with her heart in her throat for what he was going to tell her. However, Chester, he just whispered. It was a secret, and turned to go to the dining room where they had agreed to meet again with the parents. Walking away with a smile from the confused Victoria, she was turning over in her mind her parents' request to take care of their daughter, hiding from Leon, who was looking for him everywhere. Hazen thought about the problem he had ahead, knowing that if he couldn't contact his master, he could get really angry. If that night he hadn't felt compassion for the boy, none of this would have happened. Hayden had to get rid of the magic blocker as soon as possible, no matter what. While looking for a place to hide from Leon, The cat climbed up to one of the castle balconies. When he saw the Duke Hayden's office door, the kid was fascinated by the size of the room, and Victoria asked Ron to prepare a carriage for the next morning. He started scratching it, hoping that Chester would be there. Leon approached from behind and happily caught the cat he had found. The cat tried unsuccessfully to escape from his arms, holding the cat tightly. The boy told him his worries about Victoria's departure. Victoria found the Duke and her father in the cellar, choosing wine for dinner. With a smile, the girl reminded Chester how he had told her he didn't drink. The Duke jumped at hearing that the guy wanted to have a drink with his future son-in-law Victoria, was about to tell him, Chester, that it was time to go back, but Rosalie asked her not to worry and let them spend time together. The woman took her daughter away and wished the men to have fun. Victoria feared that her father would embarrass the Duke with strange questions, but the Baroness reassured her, because if Chester didn't like Aiden, he wouldn't have invited him to drink after a while. The four of them sat down to dinner, and the girl noticed how well her parents got along with the Duke. Victoria was impressed by how well he presented himself, managing to convince the guy and the Baroness so she could pick up her things and tell her parents everything in person since the kid couldn't be left alone. By the end of dinner, the Duke and Aiden were already visibly merry, and Rosalie apologized to her daughter for that. She suggested taking Chester to the guest room so he could rest and recover with the help of the butler Murphy. Victoria took the Duke to the guest room and stood next to him when he asked how Chester was feeling. He murmured something unintelligible and looked at her in a way that made her heart race. To her horror, Victoria realized that the Duke's disheveled appearance was very attractive to her, noticing that she couldn't look at him. Without those thoughts, the girl decided to leave the room as soon as possible, apologizing in advance. For having to touch him, she helped him undress and settled him on the pillows. Victoria thought that the Duke and the guy had had a great talk since they both ended up pretty drunk during the conversation. The girl's father was telling Chester about his childhood. Aiden commented that despite the rumors, Victoria had a wonderful character, and the proof was how she took care of Leon. The guy confessed that he was worried about what people thought of their wedding, and she had to leave before he woke up, so she asked for the carriage to be sent at dawn. Upon leaving the room, the butler, because although his family was noble, not too much, the rumors about the girl weren't good at all. In response, Chester assured him that the guy shouldn't worry, because he would defend Victoria from anyone who dared to hurt her later. The Duke was telling his future father-in-law with a smile how fascinated he was by the girl's beauty and singing, remembering that Chester couldn't stop smiling, not even when he fell asleep, and Victoria thought it was because of the alcohol as she wished him good night. The girl was about to leave, but the Duke murmured something to himself again. Chester spoke so unclearly that Victoria, without understanding what he was saying, leaned closer to him. Chester took her hands and asked her not to speak to him so formally. Victoria didn't understand what he meant, and the Duke, smiling, asked her to call him by his name. Meanwhile, Bill, putting the mask back on and smashing everything, was furious because Hayden still hadn't shown any signs of life. A little calmer, he waved his hand and ordered the servants to find him and find out what had happened. Chester approached the surprised Victoria and gently caressed her cheek with his hand. Smiling, he said that from now on, thought the owner of the house believed the girl was a professional scammer. Chester was convinced that Victoria had fallen into the trap. He also wanted to call her by her name, and Victoria felt her heart break, unable to withstand the tension. She turned around to run out of the room, supposedly to get honey water for the hangover, but before she could leave, Chester took her hand and got up from the bed, asking her to stay. It turned out he thought all of this was a dream, because otherwise Victoria wouldn't have accepted his caress. He thought that if it wasn't a dream, she wouldn't look at him that way. Realizing it was a dream, the Duke decided not to fear the girl's reaction. He thought nothing would happen if he told her. What was troubling him inside? Holding his head with his hands, Chester confessed that all his life he had believed he didn't need a family. To his bewilderment, he explained that he had always been used to loneliness. For him, family was nothing more than a prison under his father's control who beat and oppressed him. It was precisely because of his father who used force for any reason. Just for being his father, family was always hell for Chester. When he grew up, he left home and for a while wandered alone in the world. Then he thought that loneliness was the best option, but upon meeting Victoria, he changed his mind immediately, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. For that reason, the Duke ordered the servant. If it weren't for that obstacle, he would have immediately expressed his desire and selfishness to be with her. Taking the girl's hand, Chester confessed that for the first time he wanted to overcome that barrier of his view on family. Suddenly he fell silent, and the Duke wondered why, if it was just a dream, he still had such a strong desire to sleep, closing his eyes and squeezing Victoria's hand tightly. Chester let himself fall onto the bed and began to snore loudly. The Duke held her so tightly that she couldn't break free, so she ended up falling into bed next to him. No matter how hard she tried to free her hand, she couldn't do it at all, looking at the sleeping Duke. Victoria thought about how sincere he was when he was drunk. The girl replayed Chester's monologue in her mind and tried to understand what he wanted to tell her, but he fell asleep before finishing. When the Duke woke up, he couldn't understand how he could have gotten drunk and fallen asleep at his first meeting with Victoria's parents. Just when he was about to get up and leave, he was startled to notice that Victoria was also snoring next to him in bed. The Duke jumped in surprise and fell from the bed to the floor, waking the girl. She explained to him that since she couldn't leave because Chester was holding her hand tightly, to watch every step of the girl and keep him informed of everything. Victoria put Leon to bed, convinced that staying, she fell asleep next to him. Victoria complained that it hurt, and the Duke, misunderstanding her, started trembling with fear at what he had done. Laughing that Chester didn't understand her well, the girl explained that her wrist hurt. Smiling, he offered her his hand and suggested going for a walk, since the Duke was feeling a little better. During the walk, the girl noticed that Chester was serious and strict again, but in reality, he was serious, because he was worried about how poorly he had probably behaved while drunk. Victoria asked how the Duke was feeling and found out he was already completely sober. The girl cheerfully told Chester he had done a great job and had shown himself very well to her parents, turning around and continuing on the path. He decided to talk about the next steps and asked if the wedding ceremony would be simple since the wedding was fake. Victoria didn't see the need for a big celebration, thinking that for her, all of this was just an act. Chester told her he would take her words into account. Suddenly turning to the girl, he asked if she could accompany him to the banquet. The real Victoria, in whose place she was now because she wasn't actually Victoria Prosy, was the best for the kid. At dawn, the carriage arrived for her, and as soon as she got in, Victoria fell asleep. The banquet was planned for next week to celebrate Count Humphrey's birthday. Mrs. Selina was going to meet a lot of nobility, so the Duke had to present himself properly. In reality, he didn't want to go, but Ron tried to convince him that he shouldn't reject the Count's invitation. It was the butler who advised the Duke to go with Victoria. Since the wedding was near, it needed to be announced. Looking at the thoughtful girl, Chester thought she surely didn't want to draw too much attention. However, before he could suggest she think about it, she immediately responded with a firm yes. The girl understood that the Duke was worried because it would be hard for him to deal with so much attention once the contract was over. Because if he announced it as he would have to, people would start talking, and Victoria's parents wouldn't be happy with the rumors. However, for no one to find out that their wedding was a sham, she and the Duke would have to act like a loving couple. Victoria told the Duke not to worry because even when they divorced, she didn't plan to remarry. Chester couldn't hide his joy knowing he would be the only one in her life. It was very difficult to convince her parents that she and Leon would have to live a month in the Duke's palace in this recap manhwa, but she managed. And the girl noticed the change in his face. The Duke got up from the bench to say goodbye to Victoria's parents and returned to the castle. The girl asked how Leon was, whom she already missed a lot. Chester told her about Leon's fight with Iris, which amused Victoria a lot. Noticing that his story had made her happy, the Duke became nervous, since he expected a completely different reaction. But Victoria couldn't explain to him that the reason for her joy was that the main character of the novel had finally appeared. The girl only regretted not having seen the meeting between Leon and Iris with her own eyes, which left the Duke totally confused. Then Chester, who had stayed to talk about the boy, told Victoria that Marquis Henrion wanted to leave Iris with the Duke for a while. The Marquis planned to move to the province so his wife could recover, but he didn't want to leave his daughter alone. The Duke wanted to know Victoria's opinion on his decision to take the girl for a while. To the girl's surprise at the question, the Duke replied that now she was part of the Halos family. Victoria blushed, noticing, at the same time, a strange sparkling shine in his eyes. The girl realized that every time she saw Chester, her heart was about to burst from her chest. As they passed through the market, which was already full of life early on, Victoria asked them to stop, and her hand trembled as she accidentally brushed against his fingers. Noticing that the atmosphere between them was becoming a bit strange, she quickly decided to accept and send the Duke home. She happily thanked him and decided to take Iris with him right after the wedding. The Duke's smile was so dazzling that the girl was left speechless for a moment, not knowing how to justify the way she looked at him. Victoria said she had seen from afar her favorite flowers. However, when she turned around, Chester was very surprised because in the middle of the clearing, a huge Venus flytrap was growing. The sunset fell, and it was time for the Duke to say goodbye to Rosalie and the man who was still swaying. Apparently, the alcohol hadn't fully worn off. The man hugged the Duke tightly and started begging him to stay. Victoria pulled Chester away from his father and asked her mother to take him inside. The girl suggested to the Duke that they wait together for the carriage and take a ride. When they reached the door, they both stood silently thinking about what to say to break the awkward moment, recalling all of Ron's advice. Chester gathered his courage and asked Victoria what her plans were for tomorrow. She replied that she was planning to go to Smegto Street. Getting out of the carriage, she looked at everything being sold, magical objects, food, and all kinds of trinkets. She hoped to find star-shaped ornaments, where they sold magical items. Quickly, the girl assured the Duke that she was only going to look, although she actually needed a poison repellent. In the original novel, since Leon returned to the Halos family, his life was always in danger. As he was the protagonist, he managed to survive, but Victoria had gotten too close to him to just stay watching. But since she had changed the order of the original story, something irreversible could happen. Finally, the carriage arrived and the girl asked the Duke to be careful on the way before leaving. Chester asked Victoria if they could go together to the shopping street. He started mumbling something nonsensical, but then he composed himself and politely asked the girl to let him accompany her. Victoria didn't understand why he was acting so weird, since his invitation seemed like a date. She didn't understand why he just kept staring at her while he thought if she didn't want to spend time with him. The girl accepted and asked if Leon would go with them because she missed him, pensive and sad because he failed to invite Victoria on a solo date. Chester went home when Leon finally fell asleep. Hagen, because the night before, Leon, looking at the sky, had wanted to catch a star at one of the stalls. Victoria noticed that the maid had not closed the window properly. Climbing onto the windowsill and pushing the window, the cat jumped outside to go to his owner. Happy that no one had seen him, he ran to the door and jumped, but suddenly something blocked his way. When he fell to the ground, Hayden realized there was an invisible barrier around the castle. Not far from there, in some bushes, Bill's servants were hiding, discussing a plan to find Hayden. One of them insisted that the castle was too well guarded to sneak in without being seen. The other said they couldn't go back empty-handed because their master might cut their throats. That's why they suddenly heard the castle knights talking about burying a dead cat they had found near the door. One of them recognized the animal as that strange cat that had been wandering around the property for several days. Realizing that the knights were talking about Bill's servants, were horrified at the thought that they would have to tell their master what they saw when Bill found out that Hayden was dead. Without taking off his mask, he furiously grabbed his servant by the neck beside himself, destroying everything in his path. Saw a beautiful magical sphere that sparkled as if it had stars in it and reached out toward it, but another hand also approached the sphere. He ordered them to bring him the heads of the entire Halos family. When the servants ran out to fulfill the order, Bill took off his mask, thinking with hatred that the Halos family had killed his mother first, and now Hayes, regaining his senses, the cat, came out of the ground, not understanding why they had buried him anyway. He now knew that the barrier covered the entire territory of the castle, and there wasn't a single crack to get through. Since he couldn't do anything in a cat's body, Hayden had to come up with something to remove the magic blocker as soon as possible. The cat returned with Leon, and the boy took the animal. Dirty with the maid, the kid asked T to check if the cat was hurt. Since he had clearly gone outside after checking the cat everywhere, the maid found no injuries, but said she and the kid would go take a bath. Both the kid and the cat tried to break free from T's hands, who was determined to take them to the bathroom. The butler greeted Chester when he returned and asked how the presentation went, upon hearing noise in Leon's room. The Duke went to see what was happening. However, Ron was still trying to pry from Chester how the day had gone, and when she looked up, the girl saw Duke Chester. In the morning, the Duke was in his room. Remembering the day's moments, the Duke smiled unconsciously. Noticing this, the butler assumed everything had gone wonderfully. But suddenly, Chester jumped on him furious, saying it was Ron's fault that they hadn't liked his gift. Although he didn't understand where he had gone wrong since the Duke had personally bought it, Chester couldn't stop anymore. He gave Ron the opportunity to make it right by ordering him to reserve a table at a nice restaurant on the shopping street. The Duke wanted the butler to reserve the table for tomorrow, and also find out what Victoria's favorite food was. Additionally, remembering that Leon would be going with them in this recap manhwa, Chester asked to find a place with a play area upon learning that the restaurants Ron proposed did not have a play area. The Duke ordered him to install one before tomorrow. Besides that, instead of reserving just 3 spots, Chester ordered to reserve the whole street for them. Ron went to fulfill the orders. Thinking that this peculiar first love of the Duke would someday end with him upon seeing his uncle at the door, Leon ran happily towards him. Explaining that he had bathed at that time because the cat had made him dirty, Chester told the kid that they would go see Victoria tomorrow, completely decorated with stars and constellations. Ron entered the room to inform his lord that the carriage. The excited boy threw himself around the Duke's neck and hugged him tightly, burying his nose in his nephew's hair. Chester thought that he too was actually looking forward to the meeting with the girl. Was ready. The butler was worried about the Duke's fate, but they both knew this would help clarify the matter of the accident with the carriage. Chester turned to leave, and Ron advised him not to go through the market. Just one day she fell asleep reading a book. Elsa woke up as one of the book's characters, Victoria, who was just a character, since the leaders would gather there. Also, the servant knew that if his lord went to the market, he would end up buying a bunch of star-related stuff. Without replying, Chester left the castle, remembering his last encounter with his brother. That time, sitting under the starry sky, Ian told him how much he loved his son, the stars, and how he wanted to introduce them. Upon stepping out into the courtyard and looking at the clear sky, Chester mentally promised his deceased brother that he would find his son. Despite the servant's warnings, the Duke ended up in the market where he encountered Victoria, who was supposed to be at home. The girl told him that she had already finished her business and had just gone to the market for the sphere, but Chester didn't want to give it to her. The vendor informed them that it was the last magical sphere, which began to glow when touched. Victoria couldn't let the gift she had chosen for Leon slip away, so she and the Duke started arguing, and the girl decided to be clever, distracting Chester by spinning him around, and took the sphere. Having gotten what she wanted and asking for it to be put in a gift box, Victoria was on cloud 9 with happiness. Secondary, and didn't influence the story. Elsa didn't care about that protagonist because of her outlook on life. Chester, annoyed, couldn't believe that a girl used to luxury could be so happy over a simple toy. When she was getting ready to go to the castle, she invited him with a smile, but the Duke thought it was fake. Victoria felt hurt that he refused to go to the castle with her, and at that moment a loud gallop of horses was heard. With a great crash, a horse pulling a carriage charged at full speed directly towards the girl. The horse reared up, the girl shrank back, and as she opened her eyes the next instant, she realized she was lying on the Duke directly on the ground, going over what had just happened. Victoria understood that it was Chester who saved her. Taking her in his arms and jumping aside when he stood up, he watched how the Duke helped the coachman pick up the boxes that had fallen from the carriage. Although Chester was unpleasant to him, he thought he was actually a good person and kind. Noticing an injury on his arm, he hurried to offer to treat it. But Chester refused brusquely, so the girl thought maybe she had rushed to judge his good character. Victoria also decided to help the coachman lift the boxes, and at that moment, since Victoria's demands were endless, but the man who loved his daughter so much never denied her anything. Victoria also decided to help the coachman lift the boxes, and at that moment, from the corner, a hooded man was watching them before returning to the castle. The girl thought that since the Duke had ordered them to stay, he should make sure Leon had what he needed during that time. That's why, sitting in the carriage, she happily looked at the boxes with things they had bought for the boy. Suddenly, the carriage stopped, and when she peeked out the window, Victoria saw that the Duke's carriage had broken down. Despite Chester's previous rejection, the girl suggested continuing the journey together in her carriage. The Duke instantly rejected the proposal without a second thought. However, the servant informed him that changing the wheel would take a long time. So he advised the Duke to go with the girl, remembering that Ron had asked him to return soon. For a meeting with the head of the knights, Chester finally decided to accept, especially since they traveled in complete silence. The girl felt uncomfortable because due to the boxes, they had to sit directly across from each other. Victoria also found it annoying, and that's why he ended up so deep in debt and impoverished that he couldn't resist those who wanted to collect from him. And now, for some strange reason, that every time the carriage shook, the Duke's long legs bumped against hers. The Duke tried to cross his legs, but it didn't work, and the girl started to move hers away, tired of fighting for space. Victoria decided that the best thing was to sleep during the trip and lean back in her seat. The Duke thought she was still pretending even now, because just a moment ago she was fighting him with her feet, and now she was supposedly asleep. However, looking at her more closely, he convinced himself that she was really asleep, and noticed that while asleep she looked like a little girl. However, he quickly pushed those thoughts aside, because if anyone knows how misleading appearances can be, it's him. He remembered an episode from his childhood, when his father slapped him hard just because Chester interrupted him while he was talking. According to rumors, his father was kindness personified, but no one suspected how terrible he actually was. After experiencing something like that as a child, Chester was sure that no one could deceive him with a facade. Innocently, he looked at Victoria sleeping, and thought again that she was really faking it. The cart jumped so much over the bumps that the girl hit her head against the window several times. It was up to Elsa to fix all this, and she ended up in Victoria's place due to strange circumstances to begin with. And Chester didn't understand how she could sleep through so much movement. Unable to take it anymore, he placed his hand under the sleeping girl's cheek. While asleep, she took his hand and pressed it against her cheek, while he just thought about how strange she was. Meanwhile, Leon, upon waking up and not finding Victoria by his side, ran all over the castle looking for her, dodging the servants. Noticing the commotion, Ron understood why Victoria wanted to return before he woke up. Seeing the cart approach, the butler was glad, because finally the boy could calm down when he got down and opened the cart doors. Ron was surprised to see the Duke next to Victoria, who quickly pulled her hand away from him. Upon waking, the girl felt a strong headache and realized she had been banging her head against the glass while sleeping. The doorman was just about to open the door for the Duke when Leon ran out of the mansion crying out for Victoria. The boy jumped into the girl's arms, complaining about being left alone. Ron noticed that the boy was really very attached to her, but the Duke ordered him not to let his guard down and to watch her. Victoria and the boy entered the room and sat on the bed. The girl decided to check all of Victoria's expensive dresses and jewelry to sell them and try to pay off the debts. The boy kept crying and rubbing his red eyes, pleading through sobs that she would never leave him, because without her, he was scared of being completely alone like that time in the dumpster. Victoria hugged the boy tightly and promised him that she would never leave him. Recalling the gift, she jumped up and handed Leon a magical orb that completely fascinated him. She drew the curtains and sat next to him on the bed, pressed the button on the orb, and the room filled with magical light, and all the constellations of the sky appeared on the walls. The girl told Leon not to worry anymore because this castle was his true home, now calm and feeling safe. The boy snuggled next to Victoria, hugging his new toy. She looked at him and sadly thought that soon they would have to part, and she wouldn't be able to keep her promise. The servants of the masked man informed him that the girl who found the boy lived in the Duke's mansion. When he asked them if that was the boy, they only said he had black hair and red eyes. The masked man, however, the butler who came to help her at her request, informed her that since the items weren't new, they wouldn't get much money for them. He also knew that the girl who found the boy was Victoria Prosy, a vain young woman who was the subject of rumors. He was furious because the servants took so long, and only brought him news that anyone could hear in the gossip. He called his assistant, Hayden, and ordered him to get rid of the useless servants. The masked man silently watched as his assistant eliminated them, one by one, ensuring that everyone was dead and no one else would see his face. He took off the bloody mask. After that, Heisen received the order to obtain the magic stone. Ron reported to Chester Halos. According to the gathered information, the card incident was not an accident. It was now clear that someone had planned an attack against Ian, and the Duke was furious. His whole body trembled, with the desire to know the names of the suspects. But until they found the surviving boy, it was impossible. Chester stood up, abruptly to go meet with the head of the knights. He rejected Ron's suggestion to call the chief to his office, because he wanted to go for a walk and get some fresh air before leaving. He ordered the butler to find. Upon learning that the girl wanted to help her father pay the debts, the butler was very excited, the guardian, and bring him before him. As he walked, the Duke thought about who could have attacked his brother, and for what reason. Suddenly, he heard the servants gossiping that Chester had killed his own brother to take the Duke title. Grinding his teeth in anger, he thought he had to find the real culprit to clear his name. Upon finding the head of the knights, Shane Chester ordered him to gather a search party with the best knights. He handed him the documents proving the attack against Ian and suggested to Shane to bring the guard dog as an assistant. They decided to conduct a very thorough investigation because they could no longer waste time finding the culprit. The Duke ordered Ron to return to the castle, and he himself decided to take a walk, a bit tired of holding back his anger. He let himself fall onto a bench and decided to rest a bit before getting back to work. However, he couldn't relax because nearby Victoria and Leon were playing, making a lot of noise. The Duke picked up the ball that rolled to his feet, and Victoria approached to apologize for interrupting his rest by taking the ball from his hands, impatiently waiting for her to give her consent. The couple exchanges their vows, swaps rings, and the priest declares them, since in all his years working in that house, he had never seen such kindness in her. Victoria went out for a walk to think about how to make money. The girl noticed his injury again and got upset because he hadn't treated it, as it could get infected with tetanus. Chester insisted that his hand would be fine, but the girl wouldn't back down because it was all her fault. Victoria called the maid and asked her to leave Leon with the other maids for a while and bring him the first aid kit. Chester was just getting up to leave, but noticing this, the girl told him she hoped he wasn't thinking of running away from the discomfort, and he sat down again. Taking the first aid kit the maid brought her, the girl smiled and offered the Duke to apply the medication. Hesitating a bit, he extended his hand, but she laughed and returned the first aid kit for him to do it himself and ran out. Leaving the Duke confused, night came, and Victoria put Leon to bed, who had already changed into his pajamas just to sleep. While he was falling asleep, the boy shyly asked when they would return home together. Hearing that the castle was his home, the boy became sad because he missed his grandparents. Morning arrived, and during breakfast, because selling her things wouldn't get her 80 million, dreaming that money would fall from the sky, suddenly a piece of paper flew straight at her face. Victoria noticed that Leon was eating without enthusiasm because he still wanted to go back home with her. The girl didn't know what to do. She thought about how to distract the boy from those thoughts and decided to propose going out to see the city, entering a cafe and visiting a toy store. Excited, Leon agreed, and even started jumping for joy around the room, remembering that first, he had to ask permission from the owner of the house. Victoria went to Chester's office, already expecting him to say no. Even while they were walking in the garden, the guards surrounded them from all sides while the girl thought about how to ask for permission to go out. Ron approached her to ask what she needed. Finally, Victoria decided to stop worrying about a possible rejection and entered the room. However, she didn't get to make her request to Chester when he firmly and strictly denied her request to go out. Victoria asked him to think about it again, since the boy was getting bored always being at the castle. At that moment, the girl noticed that the Duke had his hand bandaged and was glad he had healed the wound. At Ron's surprise question, Chester replied that he had healed the wound so Victoria wouldn't worry. Catching the paper, Victoria saw that it was an ad about a missing boy. The missing child was a 5-year-old Leon Halos, about him getting tetanus. The girl began to tell the butler how the Duke had asked her to treat his wound. To interrupt her, Chester abruptly asked if she planned to go out for a walk. Victoria smiled and commented that it might be dangerous for them, but the Duke ordered several bodyguards to accompany them. While watching the girl leave happily, Chester thought she was surely a fraud, since she always tried to put him in awkward situations. Leon happily ran excitedly through the city streets, accompanied by Victoria and the bodyguards passing by the shop windows, looking at the toys with enthusiasm and asking to buy everything. The girl hadn't thought about buying anything, so she looked at her wallet with concern and only found 1,000 shillings, recalling the pendant she wore around her neck that she could sell if necessary. Suddenly, Victoria saw a candy seller offering his goods for just 100 shillings. While buying a candy for Leon, Victoria felt a great relief because the boy was incredibly happy with his sweet treat. At that moment, a thief attacked a woman nearby and snatched her purse from her hands, and they were offering a reward of 100 million for his return. She immediately remembered that Leon was the protagonist of the novel she had just finished. Seeing the thief running toward Victoria and the boy, the bodyguards asked them to stay back to catch the thief. But suddenly the thief turned sharply at the corner and disappeared from sight, noticing the victim. The guard asked Victoria to wait a moment to check if she was okay. As he approached her, he promised that his partner would recover the stolen purse in that instant. The thief appeared again from around the corner and quickly ran toward the frightened Victoria and the boy. The girl picked Leon up in her arms, and at that moment the thief stumbled and fell face first right at their feet. Leon bent down to pick up the purse, but the thief jumped up and escaped again. The victim snatched the purse from his hands. The boy roughly but still kindly thanked Victoria for her help. Suddenly he offered the girl a necklace as a token of gratitude, but Victoria refused to accept it. Before she could react, the woman threw the jewel at her and quickly walked away, noticing the necklace looked quite expensive. Apparently, right at the moment he disappeared, Victoria was glad, because following the plot, she could improve her life. The girl thought about how strange everything had been because, if you think about it, the thief's behavior and the way he appeared and disappeared was quite odd. Plus, the lady didn't even greet or thank the guards for their help, but immediately gave a reward to Victoria. For the girl, it was obvious that those two had teamed up to give her the necklace. But she thought all of that couldn't bring anything good at that moment. Leon ran towards a stand where they sold all kinds of trinkets, seeing a large star on the counter. The boy's eyes lit up and he immediately wanted to buy it. The seller told him it was the last piece so he could give it to him at a discount. The girl's heart broke at the thought that she couldn't afford to buy what Leon was asking for. Remembering the necklace she had just received, she offered it to the seller as a form of payment. After examining the stones, the merchant said they seemed fake, but since the design was in fashion, he offered to pay 200,000 shillings for them. Victoria was very happy to have gotten such a large sum, because now she could buy Leon a little star. Then excitedly announced to everyone present that she wanted to invite everyone for drinks. And even though she hadn't read the whole story, she knew exactly where Leon was. That's why she ran to the dumpster. With the money she had left trembling with fear, the thieving women who crossed paths with Victoria told the masked man that the girl had sold the necklace. The masked man was beside himself with rage, since those two didn't even imagine how valuable the jewel was. He ordered them to return to the market and retrieve the necklace at all costs. After sending them away, he sat there confused, because according to rumors, the girl loved luxury, so it was strange that she had sold the necklace. The assistant Hayden, who had heard everything, suggested to his Lord Bill that they handle it themselves. He proposed it would be better to use the magic stone themselves instead of relying on the girl. According to him, it would be much safer to investigate the mansion from within, and Bill agreed, assigning the task to Hagen. Victoria and Leon were sitting in the garden. The girl was giving cakes to the boy, and the Duke was watching them from the window. Ron informed him that so far he hadn't seen anything suspicious about the girl and that she was very kind to the boy. He told him that during that misunderstanding at the market, she first worried about the boy's safety. Besides, Ron said that while watching the man's family, he found out that his butler had returned and resold all the luxury items that Victoria had accumulated. Ron, and tearing the skirt of her dress to avoid getting dirty, she started searching for the boy, willing to do anything to never be poor again. Noticed that the girl was not at all like the rumors said, and assumed that she had simply matured. However, the Duke still thought the same, believing that people don't change so easily in this recap manhwa, and Ron suggested that if you repeat a lie many times, it ends up seeming true. Stepping away from the window, Chester ordered the butler not to let his guard down and to keep watching no matter what. Ron accepted the order, but thought to himself that no matter how much he watched, he saw nothing suspicious in the girl. Victoria was playing hide-and-seek with Leon, her favorite game, and the boy crawled under a chair, taking advantage of the girl getting distracted. The boy came out from under the chair to look for a safer hiding spot, and seeing Ron coming towards him, Leon grabbed him by the leg, pleading with him to hide him better. The butler took the boy to the kitchen, where at that moment, the cook was cleaning the floor. The man told the boy not to run so fast because the floor was slippery and he could fall and hurt himself. While chasing Leon, the cook slipped and fell to the ground, and the butler went after him. Ron managed to grab a shelf, but accidentally knocked over a bag of flour that landed on his head. The boy started running happily among the men, imagining that the flour was, like in her past life, rummaging through a pile of garbage bags. She finally found the boy curled up dirty and scared. Snow, and that they were playing snowballs. Meanwhile, Victoria, who couldn't find Leon anywhere, ended up entering the library. The girl was fascinated by the number of books, neatly arranged, and stared in awe at the huge shelves. Chester was reading a book by the open window, when suddenly he heard a creak. Seeing a book that caught his attention on the highest shelf, Victoria dragged the ladder over there with effort to reach it. The book was about how to turn 10,000 shillings into 100 million. Thinking that the Duke wouldn't buy useless nonsense, the girl wanted to read it. Victoria began to daydream that by reading the book, he could indulge himself until the end of his life. But with a clumsy move, he twisted his ankle, and the girl fell down the stairs. As she fell, Victoria closed her eyes and suddenly realized that despite the fall, she didn't feel any pain for some reason. When she opened her eyes, the girl discovered that Chester, who had come to help her, was holding her in his arms. Embarrassed by how fast her heart was racing at seeing how handsome the Duke was, Victoria asked him to put her down. Looking closely, she had no doubt it was Leon Halos, because his black hair and red eyes were the marks of the ducal lineage. She thanked him for saving her, but Chester just looked at his hands in silence, pretending he didn't hear her. Victoria apologized for entering the library without warning, and explained that she was looking for Leon, saying she already knew the boy wasn't there. The girl turned around and walked out the door while still staring at his hands. Chester thought Victoria was way too careless to be a scammer, realizing he had been thinking for a while about the girl's innocent face. The Duke got angry with himself when he saw the book that Victoria had left, and couldn't help but laugh, because he had planned to throw that pointless little book away, understanding that the girl was so happy because she thought she would get rich from that book. Chester burst out laughing. Victoria walked down the hallway annoyed with herself because her heart was still pounding. Suddenly she stopped when she heard Leon's laughter coming from the kitchen. When she entered, she saw how much fun the boy was having with the cook and Ron, and she was surprised to notice that everyone was covered in flour. Victoria picked up Leon, and he fell asleep immediately. Exhausted from so much playing night fell, and Hazel approached the castle transformed into a cat. Realizing that the reward was hers, Victoria became very happy, but soon noticed that the boy had a high fever. Recognizable by her mismatched eyes, the cat jumped out of the bushes right in front of a yawning knight. Dreaming of finishing his shift and going to sleep upon seeing the cat, the guard turned around and sadly decided to accompany the animal to look for its owner. Looking directly into the knight's eyes, the cat wearing a red medallion around its neck suddenly shone with an intense light. In the next instant, using the magical power of the hasten stone, he took the form of the guard. Key Chester walked quickly to meet Shane, who was arriving with the report, anxious to know the results of the investigation. However, Shane apologized since, although the knights carefully checked the entire route from Burney to the capital, they found nothing. Chester thanked the knights for their effort and sent them to rest. Shane offered to go back to expand the search, but the Duke insisted that the night's rest. Ron shared with Chester his opinion that the killer planned everything so well that even the search team couldn't find any clues while hugging his faithful guard dog. The Duke decided to take a little walk with him since he didn't want to lock up the dog right after it had worked so hard to leave. Husband and wife. The wedding left Victoria quite exhausted, even though she only invited her closest loved ones. Wrapping Leon in a bag she found right there, she took him home, surprising her family a lot. Chester asked Ron to tell the chef to prepare a special dish for the guardian. When they returned, Kwai, who was supposed to protect Victoria, found out that plans had changed, and now he had to patrol the mansion while walking with the guardian. Chester apologized for having to lock him up. Since there were guests in the mansion, the Duke remembered how he and Ian had taken care of the puppy since it was born. He hoped that if the kid turned out to be his nephew, he would definitely introduce him to the dog, leaving the dog waiting at the door. Chester entered the castle and headed to the dining room. Seeing Victoria and Leon having lunch, the Duke stood at the entrance and thought about how everything would be when he had his own family. Noticing Chester, Victoria asked him if he had eaten yet. He replied that he hadn't, and the girl thought he looked quite confused. But since they had already seen him, the Duke decided it didn't make sense to escape. And at that moment, the chef entered the dining room. The chef asked Chester if he understood correctly that the special dish was raw chicken, and the Duke nodded upon hearing this. Victoria called the doctor who prescribed medicine for malnutrition and promised that the boy would recover. Victoria was surprised by the Duke's strange tastes and thought she would also feel uncomfortable if someone else found out, assuming that Chester wanted them to leave the dining room so he could eat in peace. The girl stood up to leave the room. The Duke noticed that Victoria was so busy feeding the child that she hadn't eaten and suggested she finish eating calmly, but the girl refused and quickly stood up, inviting Chester to start eating. Taking the chicken prepared for the guard from the chef's hands, the Duke noticed that Victoria was watching him from the corner. Unable to hold back, she told him that he shouldn't eat raw meat. The girl assumed the Duke could get food poisoning, and that to take care of Leon, he needed to be healthy. Chester was in shock for a few seconds, until he finally understood that the girl thought he had taken the meat for himself and burst out laughing. Watching Victoria walk away, he thought it was getting more interesting to be with her as he entered the kitchen. Ron discovered that the cooks were saying that the Duke, who had been so sad, had laughed a lot. The chef, sitting next to the now clean boy, whose beauty was starting to shine differently, Victoria confirmed he was the protagonist of the novel. Couldn't believe it, and even went back to the dining room to make sure the Duke had really laughed. The chef had never seen anything like it in all his career working for the ducal family, and Ron wondered what could have made the master laugh so much. After eating, Leon was always full of energy and ran all over the yard, so Victoria feared he might fall, ignoring the girl. The boy ended up falling, but he quickly got up and continued playing. Suddenly he turned and ran toward the forest, disregarding Victoria's pleas not to wander so far as she chased after him. The girl heard the child scream, and pushing aside the bushes, she saw he was crying inconsolably. Leon was sitting on the ground, and above him loomed a huge, terrifying dog that had scared him a lot. The boy couldn't calm down, because the dog was getting closer and closer. Victoria ran to help Leon, and hugging him tightly, protected him from the dog with her own body. The Duke arrived running and shouted at the dog to stay still, and the animal whimpering froze in front of the girl. Chester tied the dog to a tree and apologized to Victoria since he hadn't thought they would get so far into the forest. The girl dropped to the ground. She was very curious to know why Leon had ended up in the dumpster and if his father Ian, because nerves had left her weak. The Duke ran toward her, and Victoria felt embarrassed for always falling when he was around. When the Duke asked her if she was hurt, the girl replied that Leon was fine. Chester was very annoyed because he wasn't asking about the child, but about her. Upon hearing the screams, Ron came running worried. Victoria told him that nothing serious had happened, but the girl couldn't stop shaking her legs. She realized she didn't have the strength to get up from the ground. Leon was very worried about Victoria. She couldn't stop crying, but the girl calmed him down by saying she would be on her feet soon. The Duke handed the kicking child to Ron to help the girl under the surprised gaze of the butler and Leon Chester. He picked Victoria up in his arms and ordered Ron to call the doctor to his room while he watched them walk away. The servant wondered why the Duke had carried the girl if she had said she would get up soon. After examining Victoria, the doctor told the Duke not to worry, and informed him that the girl only had a slight sprain. Halos had something to do with the original story. He had been alone for a long time, until he met his beloved in their romance. He promised that if they applied ice to her leg and didn't force her for a few days, everything would heal without issues. After dismissing the doctor, Chester collapsed into the armchair next to the girl's bed. Victoria thought she had already had 2 chances to feel like a princess in his arms and wanted him to leave soon. She felt uncomfortable every time she remembered how everyone looked at her when the Duke carried her to the bedroom. Chester apologized to Victoria for not having tied up the guardian, as even though he was obedient, he was still dangerous. The girl hurried to assure the Duke that she understood it was all an accident and that the dog was just protecting his home. Chester promised to make up for her injury and do whatever she asked, and Victoria laughing asked if he would buy her a mansion. Taking her joke seriously, the Duke immediately asked what kind of mansion she wanted. The girl replied laughing that just meeting the guardian would be enough for her. Chester went out into the hallway where Ron and an anxious Leon were waiting. Leon couldn't wait to go see Victoria. Taking the child in his arms, the Duke calmed him down and told him not to worry. Started when he was resting in a country house. There, the girl gave life to Leon but Ian's father. Promising him that the girl would recover soon, he asked Leon to behave so that Victoria could rest and heal faster. The boy promised to do his part, jumped from the Duke's arms, and quietly went to another room. Ron, smiling, commented that the Duke was very worried about the girl. After a brief silence, Chester turned to the butler and ordered him to find the antidote as soon as possible. He suddenly realized he had judged Victoria too quickly, and that if it was all a misunderstanding, he needed to clarify it as soon as possible. The servants gathered in the kitchen were discussing what had happened with the dog, and how brave the girl was for protecting the child. Regina, one of the maids who overheard the conversation, thought that Victoria just wanted to win over the Duke by using the child. She found it very strange that Victoria had found the child in a dumpster, as no noble lady would have gone in there. They all looked at each other and decided to wait for the antidote to finally reveal the truth. The head maid entered the kitchen and got mad at those present because they were chatting instead of working Regina, opposed their relationship because she was of humble origin. Only when the father died did Ian go looking for his beloved and his son. Saying that she had already finished the head maid's task, she asked for permission to rest a bit. Upon learning that the cook was preparing soup for Victoria, Regina offered to help him while serving the soup in the bowl. She thought that if Victoria kept chasing the man she loved, she wouldn't have a future. The protagonist was sitting on the bed and Leon wouldn't let her get up to get water. The boy jumped out of bed to give her a drink himself, and walking slowly, he brought the glass closer to avoid spilling a drop. Leon was so worried about the girl that he wouldn't even let her take the glass and helped her drink with his own hands. Victoria thanked the boy and hugged him, promising not to get sick again, she thought sadly. That only a few days were left before they would part, and she would like to hug him like that for the rest of her life, hugging the boy tightly and stroking him. Victoria thought about how much she would miss her little hero. The maid brought food to the room, and Victoria and Leon sat down to have lunch. Upon trying, the first spoonful, the girl noticed that the soup was very salty, but Leon devoured his portion happily. But on the way back, his carriage overturned and crashed. Victoria understood that by being completely alone, Leon ended up wandering until he reached that dumpster. Victoria thought that someone must have spilled salt by accident, and since no one was dying from it, she finished everything quickly. Night came and transformed into... Key Hayden approached the door and pulled out a long claw from his finger, inserting it into the lock. He opened the closed door with ease, and upon entering and going down the stairs, Heisen took a stone that ignited with a flame. A bright red sphere of fire emerged from the stone through which Bill ordered him to stop and report the situation. Hayden informed that he had noticed traits in the boy similar to those of the Halos family, and that the antidote had not yet arrived at the castle. Upon receiving that information, the master ordered him to keep watching and to notify if anything happened. Recovered from her illness, Victoria finally went out to the garden and couldn't stop admiring the sky. At first, the girl got a bit annoyed when the maid suggested that she could have looked at the sky from the window of her room. But then, Victoria burst out laughing because T understood that the attentive Leon wouldn't let her peek out the window. Smiling, she thought about how Chester could doubt her kinship with the boy, if even in character they were similar. She felt uncomfortable receiving a reward for an orphan child. Victoria didn't know what to say to him when the boy woke up. Victoria enjoyed the tea and every breeze after so many days locked up, noticing that it was quite cold outside. She jumped up to go grab a cloak, put a shawl over her shoulders, and just in case took a sweater for Leon before leaving the room. As she went down the stairs, she suddenly stopped thinking that before they seemed wide, but now she had gotten used to them. As if she were in her own home, recalling that the boy was probably already waiting for her. She ran outside and suddenly the Duke called her Victoria, thanked him for worrying about her health, and noticed a dog peeking out behind him. Seeing the dog, the girl got excited and hurried to meet the guardian. Chester told her that the dog had prepared something for her. She turned to the guardian, who couldn't stop wagging his tail. The Duke stepped aside from the dog and the girl saw it approaching her with a flower in its mouth. When the dog arrived, it placed the flower at Victoria's feet, and she, thanking him, picked up the gift and asked Chester for permission to approach. Slowly, she approached the dog and the guardian leaned down, letting himself be petted while hugging the dog Victoria. She wondered how long the Duke had trained him, since the animal couldn't have done that on its own, thinking about how Chester had that sensitive side. But she quickly pushed those thoughts out of her mind. The girl knew the Duke adored his nephew and would surely take care of him. She looked at him and noticed his expression had softened. Realizing she had been staring too intently, the girl suddenly stood up and said she had to leave. Seeing the dog whimper, Chester was surprised, thinking he was also sad about Victoria's departure. The next morning, the Duke watched from the corner as the girl fed Leon with a little spoon. The cook, who suddenly appeared, offered the Duke to join them for breakfast, thus revealing Chester's presence. Responding curtly that he was just passing by, the Duke turned around and left quickly. Victoria asked the cook if the Duke would join them and found out he had been watching them. From the door since then, the girl started to notice that Chester was watching her everywhere. The Duke seemed to appear by coincidence wherever they were, whether in the garden or at the palace. He even seemed to accidentally enter the library when Victoria was reading books to Leon one day while serving tea to Victoria in the garden. T noticed that something amused the girl a lot. Victoria whispered in the maid's ear to look behind the tree. The girl married for convenience to Duke Hados, the most important and famous man in the empire. Chester enters the room, wearing only a robe, so all she had left was to collect her money. Since the boy disappeared, several children had already been brought to the Duke claiming to be his nephew. T turned around and saw the Duke was behind the tree watching them from there because of this behavior. Victoria thought the Duke still considered her an imposter, and that's why he was watching her. However, the maid believed that assumption was incorrect. Since there were always many guards around who could do it, the maid suggested to Victoria to ask him directly what it was about, since maybe he wanted to tell her something but didn't dare. While the girl thought about whether she should talk to Chester, he himself didn't understand why he was doing that, always appearing out of nowhere. Ron asked the Duke if he wanted to talk to them. Since he noticed how Chester was looking at Victoria embarrassed and blushing, the Duke responded brusquely that he was just wandering around. Since he noticed how Chester looked at Victoria embarrassed and blushing, the Duke responded curtly that he was just wandering around. Turning to leave, he bumped into Victoria, who was behind him, and she suggested joining her game. However, the Duke responded bluntly and categorically that he wouldn't. Then the girl asked him why he was watching if he didn't want to play. Since it seemed to her that he wanted to play with Leon, Chester insisted he was just walking around his land and wasn't following anyone. To his pretense, Victoria commented ironically that yeah, sure, she believed him. But all those people didn't know that Chester Halos could verify if it was the right boy by giving him a potion that revealed the true color of his eyes. Once again, they started to argue, but Ron appeared between them, trying to calm them down. Suddenly, someone gave Chester a pat on the leg, and looking down, he saw Leon inviting him to play together. The Duke was startled by Victoria's angry voice. She told the boy that Chester was busy and couldn't play with them. Looking at the girl and bending down next to the boy, the Duke agreed to play with him. The Duke justified his change of decision by saying he couldn't refuse a child. After a minute, Ron watched happily as the three played happily with the ball. After the game, Leon invited Chester and Victoria to his room, promising to show them a treasure. The Duke, who had already been in the yard for a long time, was in a hurry to get back to work, but the boy started to cry. Not wanting to make the kid feel bad, Chester agreed to play a little longer with him. Seeing them, Victoria thought the Duke had a very soft character. Since his nephew could manipulate him however he wanted, seating Chester in an armchair, Leon handed him a magic sphere that Victoria had given him. The Duke recognized that object immediately, the one he and Victoria had argued about in the market that first morning. The Duke got angry every time he realized that foolish and greedy people. The girl told Chester that what Leon loved most in the world were the stars. She remembered how Ian had told her how sweet her son smiled when he looked at the starry sky, noticing that Chester was watching Leon attentively and surprised. Victoria thought he was doubting again that he was her nephew. The girl wanted the Duke to become friends with her nephew before leaving, so she decided to encourage him to do so, and told him how the boy took care of her devotedly while she was sick. To completely win over the Duke with the charm of the little one, she asked Leon to sing to Chester, a song about a little star. Victoria accompanied the boy singing, and the Duke noticed he couldn't take his eyes off her. He started rubbing his eyes hard, and the girl thought Leon's song had moved Chester to tears, hoping the Duke would congratulate the boy. Victoria asked if he wanted to say something, but Chester couldn't utter a word, because he felt his heart pounding strongly at how beautiful he thought the girl was. Trying to control himself, he praised the boy in such a serious tone that Victoria and Leon shrank under his gaze, tried to pass their children off as his nephew. Every time this happened, he felt frustration because he still hadn't been able to see the boy. In the next instant, Chester jumped from the chair and ran out of the room, while Leon became sad, thinking that he didn't like the song. The girl hugged him, trying to comfort him. And without understanding what was happening to the Duke again in this recap Manhwa, whom she almost considered a normal person when leaving the room, Chester was banging his head against the window, convinced he was going crazy. And that's when a surprised Ron found him. Turning around, the Duke suddenly decided he needed to train urgently in the courtyard, and he ran out. A carriage pulled by white horses arrived at the palace with a creak. Helping the red-haired girl down from the carriage, her servant commented that it was rude to arrive uninvited, but she replied that with the relationship she had with the Duke, that wasn't necessary. Throwing open the mansion doors, Casey immediately entered looking for Chester. Leon was sitting with Victoria in the dining room, waiting for his favorite chocolate pudding. At that moment, they heard Casey's unfamiliar voice, in person, and that's why he didn't know what he was really like upon learning that Leon was the Duke's missing nephew. Searching for Chester throughout the house. As she rushed into the dining room and saw strangers, the girl apologized because she didn't know the Duke had visitors. The maid informed that Chester was training in the courtyard, and upon hearing his name, Victoria was left thinking, since she couldn't remember that character in the book. Noticing Leon, Casey suddenly screamed and ran towards him, grabbing the boy by the cheeks. And looking at him closely, she was glad they had finally found Leon. With her enthusiasm, she startled the boy so much that he cried and ran towards Victoria. Petting the boy, the girl calmed him down and told him he had nothing to be afraid of. When Casey assumed Victoria was Leon's nanny, the girl suddenly remembered her in the novel. Casey Reynolds was the only daughter of Count Reynolds. Victoria remembered that Chester's father and the Count were great friends. They used to visit each other often, so their kids also became close, which is why Casey called Chester Big Brother without any shame. However, in person, that behavior seemed to Victoria more rude than spontaneous. Watching Victoria closely, Casey thought she was too young and pretty to be a babysitter, noticing that the girl had a good eye. Victoria's parents sighed in relief since for a moment they thought he was her son. Victoria's mother gave clothes for Leon. Victoria introduced herself and explained that for certain reasons, she was living for a while in the Duke's mansion. Hearing the name, Casey continued. She was surprised to find that the extravagant lady she had heard so much about was right in front of her. She hurried to apologize for her words, but Victoria told her she wasn't wrong, though everything was different now. Casey immediately started calling her Vicky, which she didn't like at all since they barely knew each other. After searching her bag a bit, Casey pulled out a gummy bear and gave it to a very happy lion. Victoria wondered, surprised how such a big bear had fit in such a small bag. Noticing her look, Casey thought that Victoria liked the bag and decided to gift it to her, insisting she accept the present. Since anything could come out of that small bag, Casey asked her to accept the gift as thanks for forgiving her rudeness. The girl looked at the boy with admiration, convinced that he resembled Chester a lot. Victoria said she was completely sure that he was the Duke Halos' nephew, and that no antidote was needed after learning that Victoria had brought the boy, that she had saved since her daughter was little. The girl was surprised at how much her parents loved her protagonist. Casey ran over to her with questions, eager to know all the details while training with the knights. The Duke defeated them all in fencing, and Ron, who approached him, advised him to rest a bit. He thought the knights might misunderstand his attitude and believe he had come to take revenge for his failure in the hunt, but the Duke told the butler he was just trying to sort out his thoughts while putting away Chester's sword. Ron informed him that Miss Casey had arrived at the castle. The Duke froze for a moment, but as soon as he knew that Casey had talked to Victoria, he ran out immediately. Chester was hurrying to Victoria's room, even though Ron asked him to stop and invite Casey to the lounge. However, knowing Casey's character, Chester couldn't afford to lose a minute. Ron thought the Duke feared that Casey would tell Victoria dark stories from his childhood, but he just asked him not to bother him. The girls were sitting in the room chatting while having tea with pastries, saying it was now their turn to ask Casey. Ron thought the Duke was afraid Casey would tell Victoria dark stories from his childhood, but he just asked her not to bother him. The girls were sitting in the room chatting while having tea and pastries, saying it was now their turn to ask Casey, since they even kept her childhood things. However, Elisa didn't understand how such good parents could have such a problematic daughter like Victoria. She asked Victoria if she knew what nickname Chester had as a kid, going through various memories in her mind. Victoria couldn't think of anything other than Icicle and Grumpy, and as Casey got closer, she told her that when they were little, they called Chester Talentless Face, and Victoria burst out laughing. Victoria was having so much fun with Casey. She felt like she was with her best friend at that moment when there was a knock on the door and Chester, panting, peeked in to apologize for interrupting the chat, launching himself at Casey, asking what had brought her there, and noticing her anger. Victoria thought she had heard how they were laughing about his nickname. Just as blunt, the Duke called for Casey to the room. To talk about the reason for her visit, Leon, startled by Chester's unexpected arrival, thought he had gotten mad at him for something. Victoria hugged the boy tightly and reassured him, explaining that he hadn't done anything wrong. Once seated in the room, Casey insisted she had only come to visit her little brother, whom she hadn't seen in a while. Chester, cold and sharp, asked why he had been talking about him with Victoria. Casey kept insisting that none of that had happened, noticing his furious glare. Upon entering the boy's room, the girl saw that he was already awake, and after asking him how he felt, she decided to change the subject and started talking about Leon's discovery. Chester told her he wasn't sure if that was the kid, since he had checked everyone using the antidote, but Casey was convinced that Victoria wasn't a liar, even though Chester thought there was nothing wrong with being cautious. The girl started defending Victoria, believing she was a good person, incapable of deceiving. Upon learning that Casey had even given her the nickname Vicky, the Duke put his hands on his head, not understanding why suddenly everyone was so on her side, but the girl wouldn't stop talking about how kind, attentive, and pretty Vicky was. Suddenly, Chester confessed that he already knew all that without being told, leaving Casey very surprised. The Duke wondered why every time he looked at Victoria, everything around him lit up with a bright light, thinking he had trouble perceiving reality. He decided to go to the doctor to find out the cause of his illness. Victoria was pulling out one toy after another, and candies from her magic bag, which had Leon completely fascinated. Taking advantage of the fact that the boy was distracted with the toys, the girl flopped onto the bed, since she hadn't been able to sleep well from taking care of the little one. Noticing that, she decided to take his temperature. She touched his forehead and froze because the boy called her mom. Victoria had fallen asleep, and not wanting to wake her, Leon, tired of playing alone, went out to look for someone. When he stepped out the door, he discovered that the castle was completely empty, and there was no one around. Thinking it was a game of hide and seek and that he had to find everyone who had hidden, she started opening all the doors one by one, and when she opened another door, she entered a spacious room and stood at the threshold. As if everything had frozen, the bedroom was decorated with stars and constellations, and anything related to celestial bodies, as she opened her eyes and realized she had fallen asleep, leaving Leon playing alone. Victoria jumped out of bed when she didn't find the kid in the room. She ran out to look for him, scared he might have gotten lost, and bumped into T.A., who calmed her down and suggested they search for the boy together. Chester was walking furiously down the hallway, replaying the conversation with the doctor in his head. Knowing that the symptoms only appeared when he saw Victoria, the doctor told him it wasn't a psychological issue, since he plans to spend the wedding night with his wife. The girl gets nervous and panics because that wasn't in the contract. Sitting next to him on the bed, Victoria told him she wasn't his mother, and the boy broke down crying inconsolably in the novel, and he started laughing strangely. The Duke was really annoyed that the doctor found that funny, and suddenly he stopped, realizing that without noticing he had arrived at Victoria's room. Thinking that his doctor was a fraud, he turned around and quickly headed in another direction. Ron, passing through the hallway, saw Victoria crying. Standing there, she turned to him, with red eyes from tears, and told him that Leon had disappeared, asking for his help. She admitted that she had dozed off for a moment, and upon waking noticed that the boy was gone, and Ron told her not to worry, promising to find Leon. As he approached the room where no one was allowed in, Chester frowned upon seeing that the door was open. He burst the door open, ready to catch the intruder and pounce on him. But inside the room, Leon was waiting for him, sitting on the floor and hugging a little star to his chest. Chester, surprised, couldn't understand what the boy was doing in that room. Leon, still smiling and hugging his toy happily, told him that he had found the room where the little star lived. Chester stood frozen, not understanding why he couldn't ask the boy. It was originally said that the boy had lost his memory due to the trauma of the incident and didn't even remember his mother's face. To leave the room, he had prepared for the real Leon, looking at the boy. He thought about how well that room suited him, while Leon cheerfully invited him to play. The Duke agreed to play for a while with the boy, and Leon happily settled him down next to him on the floor. Chester asked him why he was alone and not with Victoria. The boy confessed that the girl had fallen asleep and didn't want to wake her up but got bored being alone. Upon hearing Victoria's name again, the Duke felt uncomfortable, since lately she kept appearing in his mind. Chester didn't understand why she came to his mind even when he was going to sleep. The doctor hadn't told him anything clear, and he was so tired of that he decided to avoid everything related to the girl. Leon suggested to Chester to sing, so he wouldn't get bored while Victoria slept, and the Duke agreed, laughing. The boy hugged his toy and started singing the little star song that he had sung last time. Upon hearing it, the Duke imagined Victoria again, and he couldn't understand what kind of illusion that was. Meanwhile, Victoria was searching for Leon throughout the mansion along with the servants. The girl didn't know how to explain that to Leon, so she simply hugged him and calmed him down, promising that he would see his family soon. With Ron, she ran towards the second hallway where there were many rooms. She couldn't calm down, thinking that something had happened to Leon, and her eyes filled with tears. Suddenly, one of the doors opened and Leon peeked out with a cheerful shout, waving to the girl. Victoria ran towards him, picked him up and hugged him tightly. Happy that he was okay. Due to the commotion in the hallway, the Duke came out of the room behind the boy and realized again that he was staring at the girl intently. For a long time, everything around him lit up and he quickly forced himself to stop doing so. Victoria apologized for the commotion and explained that everyone was looking for Leon and had gotten really scared for him when they noticed she was truly worried. Chester admitted it was his fault because he knew the kid was alone, but didn't think it would scare Victoria that much. The girl suddenly stood up, her head spinning, and almost fell to the ground, but Chester managed to catch her. And she ended up back in his arms. Ron assumed that, like last time, she had gotten too worked up and that's why she was out of strength. Chester said the girl needed to rest, and she felt embarrassed because she always ended up falling on the Duke. The boy was surprised to learn that she wasn't his family, and Victoria introduced herself kindly, offering to let him call her Vicky. Noticing that Victoria was still weak, Chester opened the door to a room so she could rest there. Without having to go to his bedroom, Leon entered the room with the girl, and she couldn't believe what she saw when she noticed that the whole room was decorated with stars. Days later, sitting in the garden with a cup of tea, Victoria thought she wanted to go home soon. Since Leon got along well with everyone in the castle, she could leave him in their care, especially knowing that the kid was the Duke's real nephew. She was sure he would be fine in the mansion, remembering how Ron had told her when he entered the star room. He told her that the Duke had personally bought all those decorations as Ian had told his brother. How much his son loved the stars made Chester decide to decorate the room he had prepared for him like that. Upon hearing all this, the girl remembered how upset Chester was when he couldn't get the star sphere. Either way, the girl knew she could now be at ease and only had to get the money and leave the castle. Victoria felt sad because she would no longer see all those she had gotten so used to. Leon promised the girl that he would eat well and take his medicine on time to recover soon, even though he had already bathed him once. She knew they wouldn't stop her if she wanted to see Leon, but she also understood that she could no longer intervene in the story, where the protagonists were already defined. Feeling a great sadness, Victoria decided she needed to cheer up and eat, something sweet to lift her spirits. She rejected T's offer to bring her a cake, deciding to go herself for the sweets. And leaving the maid playing with Leon, the girl ran to get her magical bag. As she passed through the garden, she suddenly heard the servants whispering about the Duke and began to eavesdrop on their conversation. The servants were saying that the ducal carriage accident had been planned by Mr. Chester. They said he did it to obtain the title, and that his investigation to find the culprit was just a facade. The girl got angry hearing all that nonsense. Stepping out from the corner, she furiously looked at the servants and ordered them to confess immediately who had told them such nonsense. Just before this, Chester was in his office working and feeling very tired. He decided to take a break. She approached the window and opened it, looking out at the garden where Victoria was hanging out with Leon and T, once again Chester. The boy still smelled strongly of garbage, so Victoria took him back to the bathroom after making him shine and dressing him in clean clothes. He realized he couldn't take his eyes off the girl as the Duke stepped out of the castle to stroll among the trees, just when Victoria went to grab some sweets. He was glad to clear his mind a bit, although he knew he had to get back to work. Suddenly, Chester noticed that without realizing it, he was heading towards where Victoria and Leon were leaning against a tree. He couldn't understand why he couldn't do anything about that obsession. Suddenly, he heard the servants whispering as they talked about the rumors about the carriage accident just when the Duke was about to turn around to head back to the castle. He heard Victoria's voice coming out from the bushes to defend him. She scolded the servants for spreading absurd rumors about the Duke. Without any proof anger in her voice, she forbade them from talking about it again, assuring that Chester hadn't done any of that. Seeing all this, the Duke felt his heart pounding hard in his chest. Suddenly, Sal came out from behind the trees and asked Victoria if she hadn't been walking for a long time in the cold wind, scaring everyone, saying she was really cold. The girl sat the boy at the table to eat. At first, Leon resisted, but in the end, Victoria managed to convince him to eat. The girl turned around to go back to Leon, but Chester, who was heading in the same direction, followed her, thinking about what he had heard. Might have bothered him. The girl turned and asked him, however, he confessed that the rumors didn't interest him at all, which surprised Victoria a lot. She didn't understand how he could stay still and quiet being innocent, because in her place she wouldn't be able to sleep peacefully. Tilting his head, Chester asked her where she got such confidence in her innocence. As the girl couldn't tell him the truth about the book she had read, she only admitted that she saw him as a completely different person. Victoria was sure that if Chester were a criminal, he wouldn't have gone through so much trouble decorating the room for his nephew. Looking at the girl's green eyes, the Duke's heart started pounding treacherously again, and his face turned completely red. Regina listened as the maids commented on what had happened in the garden, and she got angry because the imposter had scolded them. The maids were sure that a girl who cared so much for Leon couldn't be an imposter, but Regina remained convinced that Victoria, turning the meal into a game, enchanted with the boy the girl decided to take care of him until he fully recovered, was trying to seduce the Duke, who in her opinion belonged to her. The cook prepared a soup for Victoria, since the night before the girl had gotten really cold while walking with Leon. When T was carrying the bowl of soup, she ran into Regina at the door, who got mad at her for her carelessness. The girl was upset because she felt that, since the guest had arrived at the house, all of T's tasks had fallen on her. Regina thought that Victoria was pretending to be sick on purpose because she had seen how a few days ago Victoria caused a scene looking for the kid just to be carried in when entering Victoria's room. Aunt found Leon crying next to her, convinced that the girl was dying. Victoria smiled and asked them to take her away. The aunt managed to take Leon kicking out of the room so that Victoria could rest. The girl was lying down. She was thinking about how she would soon have to part with the kid, so she didn't have time to stay in bed. Sitting in his office, Chester was going through books trying to find the cause of his illness after reading a stack of novels the night before. Meanwhile, a man in a cape and mask was beating his subordinates for not managing to find the boy for him. Finally, he understood that he had simply fallen in love. He didn't exactly know what had happened, but he knew that despite the rumors, Victoria was completely different. She couldn't possibly be so extravagant and unscrupulous as to use a child for her own benefit. Suddenly, the butler entered with some documents for the Duke to sign, which Chester did after gathering his thoughts. Suddenly, the Duke decided to ask Ron why he loved his wife. Upon realizing what was going on, the butler became even more convinced that his suspicions about Victoria were true, annoyed because Ron was joking. Chester demanded an answer to his question. The butler said that love doesn't need reasons, and that even if the first impression is one, over time, feelings and attitudes toward a person change. Upon hearing all this, Chester understood that there could be no more doubts. He was in love. Suddenly, there was a knock on the office door, and Chia announced that Leon wanted to talk to the Duke. Leon rushed to hug Chester, and between tears told him that Victoria was dying. T hurried to calm the situation, explaining that the girl only had a cold, and that she had taken the kid out for a walk so that the lady, looking at his bloodied hands, he gave them a month to find and bring him the boy's body. Victoria took the frightened Leon to present him to his parents. Could rest. Upon learning that Victoria was alone resting in the room, Ron understood that it was a great opportunity for the Duke. The butler called him and whispered in his ear that it was the perfect time to go pick flowers. Chester waited anxiously behind the corner of Victoria's room, waiting for Ron and not understanding what he was doing there. The butler who arrived handed him a bouquet of freshly cut flowers from the garden. He fixed the Duke's shirt and sent him to the girl. Ron asked Chester to trust the experience of a married man and advised him to be kinder because girls like that, Victoria, with a severe headache, couldn't sleep. So she was tossing and turning in bed when she heard a knock on the door. She greeted the Duke with a smile. He couldn't sleep, so he tossed and turned in bed when he heard a knock at the door and welcomed the Duke with a smile. Because even though her whole body ached, she didn't want him to see her in that state. When Chester entered the room as usual, he shot a glaring look at the girl and received an equally fierce one back. Ron, who was behind him, pushed his boss. It all started 3 months ago when the man to settle Victoria's father's debt demanded that they hand over his daughter. The man and woman were very touched to see how adorable he was, reminding him to be polite. Victoria was surprised to see the bouquet of flowers in the Duke's hands and asked what that was, but Chester brusquely replied that he had only come to give her the flowers. Ron sat on the floor holding his head, because the way the Duke spoke couldn't exactly be called kind. Seeing that the situation needed saving, he sent Auntie to the room with a glass of warm water. Chester took the glass and handed it to the girl, saying that those flowers were good for a cold if brewed as an infusion. Standing next to Victoria, the Duke began to pluck the petals from the flowers, one by one, and drop them into the glass. As she watched him, the girl thought that she definitely liked that character, and that even those small gestures were pleasant because sometimes he seemed so attentive. But suddenly Victoria wondered why they were doing all that, since T's arrival had clearly been planned. Chester promised that after drinking the infusion, she would feel better and asked her to do it, thinking it would disguise the warning that she shouldn't infect Leon. Victoria only said out loud that she would try not to overexert herself. Chester didn't understand why the girl had gotten angry. The boy was surprised at how much Victoria looked like his mother. At night, when the girl tucked him in, and while she drank the infusion, he told her he knew he did that to protect Leon. Noticing that his boss was puzzled by that unexpected turn, Ron intervened again to save the situation, running into the room, grabbing the Duke by the shoulders and taking him away, pretending they had important matters to attend to. When they returned to his office, Chester was upset, not understanding why Victoria reacted that way to his concern. The butler noticed that maybe it was because Chester. For a long time, he thought she was a scammer and treated her coldly because the Duke had treated her that way for so long. Now the girl struggled to believe in his sincerity, according to Ron. They could only wait for that mess to finally get resolved. Meanwhile, Heisen realized it made no sense to keep using the Kai appearance. Since the commander wanted to send him to investigate, it was clear that as soon as Heisen joined the search party, he would stray from the true objective that couldn't be allowed. So Heisen decided to regain his true form. He was really surprised that the commander called him, since just today he had been assigned to protect the child. The commander ordered him to join the search party. Leon took her hand and asked her not to leave him alone, realizing that the boy had spent a long time alone in a landfill and was very scared. On a new expedition, since the knight himself wanted to participate in the investigation, however, the boy didn't understand why he was being called. If only the best were sent to the search. The commander was surprised that the boy rejected. For the second time, the opportunity that was offered to him as he left the office, Heisen, with a glint in his eyes, jumped high to a tree. By pressing the stone on his neck, he removed the key appearance and let it drop from the tree, knowing that if he disappeared suddenly, it would be suspicious. He returned the boy to his place, erasing beforehand his memories about the trap he was in after finishing. That this time, Hayden decided to take a different approach. Victoria was having tea with Casey, telling her about all the things she had sold to save her family. The girl got up to close the balcony door from where a draft was coming, since she still hadn't fully recovered. Suddenly, a big white cat jumped onto the railing, scaring the girl a lot with its appearance as she recovered from the scare. Victoria realized that in front of her was a cute, fluffy kitten with different colored eyes. The girl lay down next to him and promised to stay all night. Leon was so fascinated with the cat that he asked the girl to keep it. Casey tried to pet the cat, but it scratched her suddenly, and it hurt quite a bit. Victoria suggested to Casey to leave the cat and keep talking. Noticing that the cat was looking at him, Leon decided to approach to pet it. However, the cat jumped into the room and settled right on Victoria's lap. The girl got nervous. But then she petted the cat, who was happy to have achieved what he wanted. Chester couldn't stay still. Knowing that Casey had arrived at his house and for some reason went straight to Victoria, fearing the girl might say something too much, he got up to check it himself at the door he encountered Ron, who had arrived with an urgent message for the Duke. Although Chester ordered him to come back later, Ron reported that they had brought a sample of the antidote to the palace, handing the Duke a small vial. The butler said it was only enough for 1 dose. The wizard managed to find a vial and sent it immediately to the castle, so they wouldn't have to wait for the rest of the order. In the morning, Leon brought Victoria's parents a drawing he had made. As Chester took the potion in his hands, he thought that even if they used it to clarify everything, the outcome was evident. That's why the Duke ordered not to tell Victoria anything for now, and to notify her in 5 days. When everything ordered arrived, Ron understood that the Duke didn't want Victoria to leave the castle too soon. When he asked if he should return the potion to the wizard, Chester replied that they weren't going to delay the test. The Duke went to find Leon and asked the butler to prepare a drink and wait for them in the starry hall. Chester entered Victoria's room, and Leon, as always, happily ran to hug his leg, saying he came for the Duke's boy. Suddenly, he noticed the cat with different colored eyes in Victoria's lap. Upon looking closely, the Duke shot a furious and threatening glance at him. Hayden disguised as the cat shuddered as he felt Chester might have figured everything out. Noticing that the Duke really did look as intimidating as the rumors said, Hazen decided to act like the most harmless cat possible, thinking Chester was upset because Victoria brought the cat without permission. In it, they appeared along with their daughter and the butler. Everyone was very touched because the boy also called them Grandma and Grandpa. She apologized and explained that the cat had jumped out the window when she went out to the balcony. The Duke wondered where the cat had come from since the trees were quite far from the window. The girl guessed that perhaps the animal belonged to someone from the mansion, but Chester didn't know anyone who had a cat in the castle. Victoria suggested taking care of the cat while they looked for its owner, but the Duke immediately refused to justify his refusal. He said Ron was allergic to animals, so Victoria thought she had no choice but to take the cat home. Imagining the girl spending time and hugging the animal, Chester felt jealous and firmly prohibited that surprising Victoria. He said he would ask Ron to find the animal's owner. The girl reminded Chester that just a few minutes ago, he had said the butler was allergic, and seeing the Duke trying to get out of the awkward situation, Casey burst out laughing. Unable to bear the girl's teasing, the Duke grabbed Leon, saying he had an important matter with the kid, and ran out of the room. Casey couldn't stop laughing because she was starting to suspect Chester's feelings. The whole family spent fun moments with the boy. They ate cookies together, read books, and also went out for walks together. Towards Victoria, so she decided to ask the girl what she thought of the Duke, and what she thought of him as a person. Between laughs, Victoria replied that to her, he was just a regular guy with a lot of money. Walking down the hall with Lion in his arms, Chester thought Casey had clearly noticed something, and that now he wouldn't escape her jokes. Seeing the Duke blush, the kid thought maybe something hurt, but Chester reassured Leon, and told him they were going to the star room as an excuse. He decided to use the star-shaped decorations he had recently bought for the room. Hugging the Duke tightly, the kid told him he loved him as much as the stars. Chester remembered how sitting in the garden Ian had told him that a child is not just a fragile creature. The brother promised that one day Chester would also discover how Leon has that incredible ability to make you smile just by looking at him. Remembering that and hugging the kid, the Duke smiled at him tenderly. Suddenly, Leon started sniffing Chester and said that he had smelled that scent before somewhere. Suddenly, a very vivid memory crossed him. The kid couldn't distinguish the faces. Taking out Victoria's old toys from the attic when the time came to take Leon to the Duke, Victoria's parents hugged him tightly, but he saw someone with a similar scent leaning over him. Those memories triggered something in Leon, a sharp headache, and he grabbed his head, crying scared. The Duke ordered Ron, who had just arrived, to call the doctor immediately. The doctor noticed nothing out of the ordinary, and the butler suggested that maybe the child's memories were coming back. When asked if it could be related, the doctor replied that a sudden headache was a concerning sign, because when memories return, it's normal to suffer from intense headaches. Saying that the child could only be helped with medicine and observation, the doctor gave him a painkiller. After thanking and saying goodbye to the doctor, Chester offered Leon, who was crying, a spoonful of the remedy, but he didn't want to take it. The Duke promised the boy that if he took the medicine, they would go together to see the stars excited. Leon asked if Victoria could come too, and Chester agreed, hugging the boy tightly, promising that the three of them would go see the starry sky. And then he took the remedy. Leon cried again because the medicine was bitter, and Ron laughing, not wanting to let him go since they had become very fond of him. After long goodbyes, the girl and the boy got into the carriage, offered him the sweet juice he had already prepared. After drinking it, Leon got sleepy, and Chester, after putting the boy to bed, was about to leave the room. He was at the door when suddenly Ron congratulated him because they had finally found the boy. He told the surprised Chester that the drink he gave Leon had an antidote. Looking at the boy in awe, the Duke was convinced that he really was his nephew. Casey got ready to leave without even saying goodbye to Chester, who, as he noticed, had been avoiding seeing her. Victoria couldn't understand what it was that she had overlooked. That's when Casey started saying strange things after the Duke left. Suddenly, Auntie ran toward her, and upon learning that Leon was sick, she handed the cat to the maid and ran out very worried. Realizing she might miss some information, Hayden broke free from Fia's hands and ran after Victoria. The girl rushed into the starry room and saw the Duke sitting beside the bed where Leon was sleeping. Chester told him that the child's memories had returned, and that was probably why he had a headache. They set off for the dukedom to return Leon to his family. Victoria was even happy to be able to return him earlier. Knowing it wasn't a cold, Victoria was relieved and sighed. Suddenly, she noticed something strange in the Duke's behavior, in the way he smiled, while tenderly holding the sleeping boy's hand, seeing that he was too serious. Victoria decided to ask if something had happened. Staring intently at the girl, the Duke suddenly apologized to her. He admitted that all this time he had behaved very rudely and had distrusted her. Thinking something was wrong with the Duke for saying that Victoria suggested calling a doctor to check on him, but Chester interrupted her with a serious gesture, assuring her that he was fine, and it wasn't a joke. At that moment, Lion woke up, holding the Duke with one hand and extending the other towards Victoria. The boy smiled, saying his head didn't hurt anymore and that he was okay, which made Chester and Victoria very happy. The boy asked the girl to lie down next to him to sleep together, however. Victoria knew that Chester had thought of every detail of the room for his nephew, and that the Duke wouldn't let the boy stay there until he recognized him as Leon. Although her father was very worried, the girl was sure that nothing bad would happen to her since they still had time, because if they had stayed together a little longer, they would have grown so attached that parting would be even harder. Upon arrival, but against all odds, the Duke stroked the boy's head and suggested staying in the room. He said goodbye and asked to surprise Victoria to let him know if they needed anything. However, Leon stopped him and asked him to lie down next to him, so that Chester and the girl would be on either side of him, unable to refuse his nephew. The Duke agreed, and along with Victoria lay down on the bed. The girl was touched that Chester stayed with Leon despite having many things to do and thanked him for taking care of the boy all day. With those conversations, the Duke realized that his heart was racing again, so he decided to change the subject. However, after a minute, Chester noticed that Victoria, just like Leon, had already fallen asleep. Unexpectedly, he reached out and stroked the girl's hair, realizing what he was doing. He turned and tried to fall asleep quickly to not think about anything. Meanwhile, sitting on the ledge, Jason watched them, not fully understanding what was happening. Victoria and Leon played happily in the yard, while Chester watched them from the window of his office. Suddenly, the door creaked behind him, and when he turned, the Duke saw Ron in the doorway, noticing the dark circles under his master's eyes. The girl was impressed by the magnificence of the palace that revealed itself to her as she crossed the doors. The butler was very startled and immediately wanted to know what had happened upon understanding that the problem had to do with Victoria. Ron tried to find out what it was about, if the young lady had already accepted his apologies. Chester, embarrassed, confessed that he was worried Victoria showed no interest in him. He recounted that night when the three of them slept together in the same bed, her heart was racing and she couldn't sleep with the pain. She realized that the only person Victoria loved was Leon. It only mattered that there seemed to be no place for him in her heart, the desperate face of his master. He made the butler laugh, and Chester, annoyed, asked what Ron was there for. He informed the Duke that Count Cedric de Rake had come to visit. Before long, he was already seated in the living room, conversing animatedly with the Duke. While they drank tea in his father's name, the Count thanked Chester for his help. In the process of signing the agreement with the imperial family, the Duke stood up and asked Cedric to leave if he had nothing more to say. The Count stood behind Chester, who was ignoring him. Surprised that he was so busy, he didn't have a single minute to talk. Of course, she knew that the owner of the palace was very rich, but every detail there was worth a fortune. They seated Victoria and Leon on the sofa in the hall. Suddenly, as he approached the window, he stopped upon seeing a girl on the street whom he recognized immediately as Victoria. Turning around, the Duke asked Cedric if he knew the girl, but he replied that he only recognized her from sight. Since she was famous in society for her extravagance, the Count was very curious. He wanted to know what Victoria was doing on the Duke's property. However, Chester brusquely replied that it was none of his business. This clearly angered Cedric. He assumed the girl had come for money, presenting the child he brought as if he were the Duke's nephew. Chester just coldly responded that Cedric was talking nonsense, but he tried to justify himself by saying he was nervous. The Count had heard that Victoria's family was in debt because of him and was on the brink of bankruptcy. He also commented that the only way for a girl who only had a pretty face to pay off debts was to win the favor of some rich aristocrat as a mistress. Laughing, Cedric advised Chester to be careful with Victoria, since he had enough money and she could take advantage of that. Unable to tolerate those words any longer, gritting his teeth, the Duke ordered the Count to repeat what he had said. Without suspecting anything, Cedric didn't finish his sentence when Chester grabbed him by the collar of his jacket and with anger in his voice ordered him not to cross the line, to wait there for the Duke, although the novel spoke of Chester Halos's extraordinary beauty. Declaring that Victoria was not at all like the Count thought, the Duke shoved him with such force that Cedric fell to the ground. Cedric sincerely didn't understand why he had fallen so low in the Duke's eyes just for what he said about that girl. In response to his bewilderment, Chester just shot him a furious look and ordered the Count to get lost before he cut off his head. Running out of the room, Cedric, offended by that treatment, promised himself he would never forget that day. Outraged, Chester ordered Ron, who had just entered, to sever all ties with the sleeping family, which surprised the butler greatly. Watching Leon wave at him from the window, the Duke asked the butler. Indignant, Chester ordered Ron, who had just entered, to sever all ties with the Drake family, which surprised the butler greatly. Observing Leon waving at him from the window, the Duke asked the butler not to pay attention to what had happened. Smiling and waving to the boy, he asked him to find out how much money and exactly to whom Victoria owed. He looked at her and thought that even if she didn't choose him, he wouldn't let her go with another just because of debts. At night, when he entered the room, the girl was struck by his perfection. Victoria was so fascinated that she accidentally said it out loud and got very nervous. After bathing the boy, who was no longer afraid of the water, Victoria tried to catch him to dry him off, but he kept running around her laughing. She said that if he kept running so fast, he would dry himself off without needing a towel, which made Victoria laugh. After wishing the girl good night, the maid was about to leave, but suddenly, as if remembering something, she turned to her. Then, as if changing her mind, she abruptly said goodbye, closed the door behind her, and left. Victoria stood there confused. Not understanding exactly what the maid wanted to tell her about the next day, she watched Leon drink warm milk before sleeping. Suddenly, she understood what her aunt meant. After all, they were supposed to bring the antidote to the castle the next day. Looking at the child, she thought sadly that there was only one day left before they had to part. When Leon finally lay down, he asked her. Timidly, Leon asked Victoria if they could sleep with Chester again, like that day, sure that this time he would snore and embarrass himself in front of the Duke. The girl didn't want to repeat it and promised Leon that they would. Next time, hugging the child tightly, she promised to fulfill his wish in 2 days. When the butler went to fetch the magic potion, the girl finally got the courage to introduce herself to the Duke. However, in her mind, Victoria was apologizing for lying to him so shamelessly. Since in 2 days she would no longer be in the mansion with tears in her eyes, she hugged the most important person to her, the one she had saved not long ago just for the reward. The butler brought the antidote to the Duke and suggested postponing the trial. A few more days, but Chester refused because a deal is a deal and it must be upheld. Gently knocking on the bedroom door of Victoria and Leon, Chester swallowed nervously and announced that he was going to enter. Upon seeing the antidote, the girl expressed her hope that it wouldn't have side effects. Chester assured her that everything would be fine, and Victoria woke Leon. Seeing the glass in the butler's hands, the boy happily lunged for his favorite juice, but Chester suddenly stopped him. Realizing that he had shouted unintentionally, the Duke frantically searched for an excuse for his startled reaction. Victoria ran to the Duke and whispered once more if the drink was safe. Chester got angry because the girl didn't trust him, and once again they started to argue in front of a surprised Ron and Leon. The Duke didn't know how to explain to the girl. The lion bowed and shyly greeted Chester, who continued to silently observe the guests. However, the Duke, who knew the girl's story, that he just wanted to delay his departure a bit. He hadn't finished justifying himself when Leon, smiling, announced that he had finished his juice. It was delicious. Worried, Victoria ran to the boy to ask him if he felt any pain, but he reassured her by saying that everything was fine. Chester reminded her that he had already said that the trial was safe. With a smile, he told her that now everyone could see that the boy was the Duke's nephew. Victoria was glad that Chester recognized Leon as his nephew, and he thanked her for her help. Following Victoria's advice, Leon happily ran to hug his uncle and squeezed him tightly. The girl was genuinely happy that everything had been resolved, but Ron noticed that tears were falling from her eyes unintentionally. Victoria was doing everything she could to hide her tears. Leon was startled to see her crying. She was desperately trying to remember something nice to stop crying, but Leon was already running towards her to find out what was happening. The Duke offered Victoria a handkerchief, but the more she dried her tears, the more she cried. A bit calmer, the girl knelt in front of Leon. She asked the surprised boy to obey his uncle while hugging Victoria. He didn't understand why she was giving him advice, suspected that she had picked up a child from somewhere just to get the reward by looking at Leon. Chester. When he finally realized that the girl was saying goodbye and thinking of leaving, Leon broke down crying and begged her to take him with her. Unable to keep watching the boy cry, Victoria asked the Duke to take him away. By the Lord's order, Ron picked Leon up in his arms, but he clung to the girl's dress and accidentally tore the ribbon from her sleeve when he saw Victoria trembling. The Duke ran to her, and she asked when she would receive her reward. Chester promised to write her a check right away. The girl apologized and said she would go home immediately, asking for the check to be sent along with her things. She thanked the Duke for everything and was about to leave. When he suddenly stopped her, Chester apologized again to Victoria for misunderstanding her, and for his lack of respect, the girl smiled through her tears and said it had only been a misunderstanding. But she was glad that everything had been resolved. Looking at her, the Duke felt that strong pang in his heart again. Seeing Leon crying again, Victoria, unable to bear it any longer, apologized and ran out of the room. Realizing he couldn't leave it like that, Chester asked Ron to calm the boy, and he himself went after the girl. Thought that his guest was the worst of all he had seen because no one before. He ran after her into the hallway and stopped her by grabbing the cuff of the sleeve where Leon had just torn the ribbon off. Knowing he couldn't force her to stay, Chester suggested checking her hand to buy time. He sat Victoria down on the living room sofa in this recap manhwa and left the room to get medicine. Pressing the Duke's handkerchief against her nose, the girl began to cry even more, thinking about the people she would have to say goodbye to because of the surprise. She jumped when Chester returned with the first aid kit and a glass of water in hand. The Duke offered to help her with the bandaging, but the girl refused and asked him to pass her the first aid kit, realizing that the sleeve was preventing her from reaching the scratches. Without much thought, Victoria ripped it off in front of the surprised Chester. After finishing bandaging her hand, Victoria told the Duke they could keep talking, knowing that he had held her back all this time without a real reason. Duke Chester couldn't think quickly about what to say. He knew that if the girl left, Cedric's words would come true, so he decided to hold her back, even if it meant lying. Victoria looked at the Duke surprised and not understanding why he was suddenly so insecure, had brought such a malnourished child to evoke pity. The Duke became even more convinced he was right. When Leon said it was Victoria, she froze in surprise when Chester proposed to her after hearing her question for the second time. The girl thought the Duke was drunk or sick, not understanding how someone in their right mind could propose something like that. She said she refused, sighing deeply. Chester asked if she really disliked the idea that much, but the girl didn't understand why she was supposed to want to marry him when they weren't even in love. And those words hurt the Duke. Clearing his throat, he told her he was doing it for Leon because the kid was having a really hard time without her. Victoria knew Leon needed her, but she couldn't understand why the Duke needed her. Gathering her courage, Chester decided to confess his feelings. But just as he said the important words, the girl sneezed loudly. Blowing her nose, she apologized and asked him to repeat what he had said. The Duke didn't respond to that, but admitted he wanted to adopt Leon, although he was afraid he couldn't do it alone. From what she heard, Victoria concluded that Chester wanted to marry her just for his nephew. The father happily hugged his daughter tightly in this recap manhwa and promised her that he would never under any circumstances hand her over to that man, who had told him his name. Looking at the girl with anger, Chester demanded she tell him. Because if a man and a woman live together without marrying, rumors can start. She understood why Chester needed that, but still rejected the proposal, since she didn't want to marry without love bowing. Victoria asked the Duke for permission to leave, but he asked her to think about it one more time, realizing that the girl was about to leave forever. Chester shouted that if she married him for 1 year, he would increase the reward tenfold. Upon hearing that, Victoria suddenly stopped, and the Duke's heart froze as he turned toward her. The girl smiled and asked if she could call him darling from now on, only with Anne's help. Ron managed to get the tearful Leon to sleep. He thanked the maid for her help and asked her to take the boys' things to the starry room, realizing that Leon was the Duke's true nephew. T was very happy. Suddenly, the girl remembered and asked the butler if Victoria had already left, because she hadn't been able to say goodbye to her. Ron was left thinking because if the Duke went after the girl to accompany her, where she had found the child, sure that she would make up excuses on the spot. Victoria recounted that she had found him in a dumpster. Why hadn't he returned yet? In Chester's mind, there was only the image of Victoria, hugging him and calling him darling. But the girl pulled him out of his dreams and reminded him that they hadn't finished signing the contract yet. The Duke's heart started racing treacherously again, and he tried to calm himself by telling himself it was just a contract. Victoria couldn't understand what was happening with his expression, and thought the Duke was disappointed by her interest in money. However, she knew that with 1 billion shillings, she could not only save her family, but also live the rest of her life without depriving herself of anything. She was also aware that in a year, she would be a divorced woman, but that didn't worry her since she didn't plan to remarry anytime soon. Victoria wondered what the Duke gained from the contract because he was not only spending a fortune, but also marked as divorced. Thinking that Chester was doing all this for his nephew, she once again thought that in the end he was too good. After finishing writing, the Duke handed her the contract to review and let him know if she wanted to change anything. The agreement stated that the marriage would be valid for 1 year and that each party had to fulfill their role if either needed a partner. And the Duke thought again that she just wanted to provoke compassion, as Leon confessed that Victoria, they had to notify the other at least 2 days in advance. And on the day the contract ended, Chester committed to giving Victoria 1 billion shillings. Smiling, the girl noted that 1 billion shillings was a lot of money. The contract stated that its contents could not be revealed to anyone, and that it could be extended indefinitely if both agreed. Upon reading this, Victoria proposed to remove the last clause. Since it wasn't possible to extend the contract forever, the Duke, startled, turned around and refused to remove that part of the contract. Victoria decided to ask if the contract would be nullified in case someone couldn't keep the secret, knowing that if that happened, they could no longer continue with the contract. Chester pondered. After reflecting a bit, he added a clause stating that whoever broke the agreement had to actively cooperate with the other party's proposal. After finishing writing, the Duke suggested to the girl that she'd think about it a little more before signing, but she told him she had already decided. Chester advised her to think it through and make a final decision, pointing out that it was a magical contract and that if it was broken, they could be severely harmed, though it wasn't fatal. Without a second thought, Victoria signed the document and handed it to the Duke. As she got up from the table, had talked to him about her memory loss, Chester became even more convinced that it was all a lie. The girl got angry. They shook hands and Chester promised to take care of Victoria, and she responded in kind. The protagonist told the Duke that she first needed to go home, and he asked when she would return. Laughing, the girl explained that to keep the secret, everything had to seem credible. She thought things had to be done properly, but Chester didn't understand what she meant. Victoria, laughing, told the Duke that he needed to meet her parents. Finally, upon understanding what she meant, Chester blushed and slapped his face, refusing. Count Humphrey was sitting on the sofa reading the newspaper when his daughter Selina burst through the door and entered shouting. Annoyed by her lack of tact, the Count ordered her to behave, and only then explained the reason for her arrival, leaning back against the sofa. The girl sweetly told her father that she'd already decided what she wanted for her 19th birthday. However, the Count reminded her that the gift topic was already closed and surprised, asked what she wanted now, Selina smiling, since she was sure she had brought the right child, and the Duke was surprised by her insistence. The butler entered the room. The girl asked her father to invite Duke Chester Hallows to the banquet for her birthday. Victoria knew the marriage was fake, and that it wasn't necessary to meet the parents, but she didn't want to hurt those two people who only had their daughter. However, she understood that they wouldn't stand the idea of the marriage being just for money. The girl confessed to Chester that she didn't want to sadden her parents, and asked him to keep up the illusion that everything was real. Once again, she asked him to pretend during dinner with her parents that she loved him, which made the Duke quite uncomfortable. The fact that Victoria thought he would have to pretend by saying that he wanted to buy a gift for her parents made him question what they liked. Victoria said a small, heartfelt detail would be enough, and the Duke decided to ask Ron for advice. Chester informed the girl that they would see her parents in 2 days. Victoria asked him to lend her a carriage, and before leaving, she decided to visit Leon. The Duke stopped her and placed his jacket over her shoulders, and explained that it was cold and windy outside. Chester, completely blushing, asked Victoria to be careful on the way. For a moment, when she looked at him, the girl thought that the Duke simply didn't want to say goodbye. Ron, upon entering, with the news that the shelf with the magical neutralizers had fallen down, was very surprised to see that Victoria was still in the castle, when he learned from the butler that Leon was in his room. The girl thanked him and said goodbye. Victoria, smiling, thanked the Duke for the coat and promised to return it the next time they saw each other, while watching her walk away. Ron couldn't quite understand what she meant by that while smiling. He thought that the Duke had invited the girl on a date. Gathering courage just as Victoria was leaving, the excited butler started talking non-stop and suggested to Chester that he help organize his first date. However, he abruptly interrupted him and ordered him to find out about the wedding hall, grabbing the Duke by the shoulders. Ron started shaking him, trying to explain that you can't book a wedding hall for a one-on-one date. The Duke calmed the butler and told him he needed the hall for a wedding, not for a date, but Ron couldn't believe it since Chester couldn't make such decisions on his own, even though Victoria liked him a lot. With an ironic smile, the Duke asked the butler to calm down, and all the bottles had broken. Since it was difficult to obtain the ingredients for the potion, they could only get a new dose in a month, and explained that the girl also had her own reasons. Realizing that Ron thought Chester wanted to force her into marriage, the Duke almost strangled him out of anger. The butler understood that the gentleman had placed some condition on Victoria, but he kept silent. Ron decided that he would guide the Duke during the wedding preparations, and he accepted. However, the only thing he was thinking about was how to prevent the girl from dating someone else, since this wasn't a real marriage. Observing him, the butler noted with surprise how blinded his master was by love. Dreaming of Victoria, Leon woke up suddenly and broke down crying bitterly. When he couldn't find her by his side crying, he ran to the window, not understanding why the girl had left him. When he looked out the window, the boy saw the cat walking around the yard in this recap manhwa, the same one that had jumped onto his balcony days earlier. Victoria returned home with a bunch of gifts for her parents. Emotionally moved, the family received the gifts in tears, noticing how beautifully they were wrapped. Since it was already late and Victoria was very tired, she decided to go to sleep. However, her parents didn't want to let her go. Chester told Victoria they would resume the conversation in a month, and the girl got upset, realizing they thought of her. They wanted to know how she had said goodbye to Leon, and how he would be without her again, realizing how good her parents were. Victoria told them that the boy would be fine, because the Duke would be a good uncle to him, to the girl's parents. They felt sad that it would now be hard for her to see Leon. Interrupting them, the girl ran upstairs. She wished them good night, threw the Duke's jacket over the back of a chair, fell onto the bed, and buried her face in the pillow. As she turned to look at the jacket, Victoria thought that the next day she would have to tell her parents about the wedding. Holding her head, she didn't understand why everything was so chaotic and why she felt like a sold daughter. Hazen prowled around the garden looking for a secluded place where he could regain his original form. He knew he had gone too far already. He reached out toward the pendant with such determination. It was getting harder to hide. Using the stone, he called his master and informed him that Leon was that boy. Bill ordered him to bring the boy in alive, or simply to kill him on the spot. After receiving the order, Hazen suddenly noticed that he wasn't alone in the garden. As a scammer, upon learning that many people had arrived at the palace before her who used turning around, he realized in horror that Leon was behind him, having left the house following the kitten. Seeing the boy in time, Hazen transformed into a cat so quickly that the boy didn't notice anything. Leon happily approached the cat while Hayden couldn't understand why the boy was out at this hour. The annoyed cat turned around and started to quickly walk away from the boy. Leon ran after the cat but tripped over a stone on the ground and fell. Seeing the boy cry, Hayes couldn't understand how someone so foolish could have Duke's blood. He turned to go to a quiet place from where he could observe everything happening. Leon began to cry. Bitterly, he begged the cat not to leave him like Victoria did. Hearing that the boy was afraid of being left alone, the cat suddenly stopped and turned back to him, rubbing his face with its snout. Happy Leon hugged the cat tightly and thanked him for coming back. Inside, Hayden advised the boy not to get his hopes up because he had only returned to prevent people from coming. Hearing Leon's cries, he really didn't care about the boy's tears. That contact didn't affect his mission. Suddenly, magic to change the appearance of their own children. She understood why the Duke was so distrustful, saying he would wait for her to be contacted in a month. Hazen heard they were looking for Leon and tried to break free from the boy's arms so he wouldn't be found there. From among the bushes, Chester, Ron, and Tia appeared frozen in shock at the sight of Leon when they took the boy home. Ann apologized for leaving him unsupervised, thinking he would sleep until morning. Chester replied dryly, asking her to put Leon back to bed. Upon closer inspection of the cat, T recognized it was the same one that had jumped onto her balcony a few days earlier. The boy said that since Victoria wasn't there, the cat would live with him, and watched as the animal tried to escape. The maid thought Leon had brought it in forcefully. The Duke explained that the boy didn't want to return without the cat and ordered T to take care of both. Until the owner showed up. Hazen was completely horrified at the idea of being left with the boy. After putting the boy and the cat to bed, T suddenly remembered that she had to tell Leon that Victoria would be back soon. Hearing this, he was very happy, and not believing his luck, he asked the Duke if it was true. Smiling, Chester confirmed what the maid had said, and explained that the girl had only returned home for a while as he approached the Duke. The parents whispered happily about how their daughter had matured and changed since she didn't make a scene. Victoria took Leon by the hand and was about to leave the room, but suddenly, Ron informed him that they had brought the object he had requested to the castle. The butler handed the owner a magical control device, capable of detecting any object and limiting its movement. Ron pointed out that if they managed to distract the cat, it wouldn't be able to leave that place for its entire life. After receiving the order and taking advantage of the fact that Faya went out to get milk, Ron took charge of setting the plan in motion. The butler showed the boy something on the ceiling, and both he and the cat looked up, taking advantage of their distraction. Ron quickly placed the magical control on the cat's collar. Ron laughed as Leon, horrified, watched the cat realize it could no longer become human. Running across the bed, the Duke commented that the little device would stay on the cat until they found its owner. Faya entered, bringing warm milk to the boy, and Chester and Ron left the room, feeling relieved that Leon was no longer in danger. The Duke, nonetheless, ordered the butler to remain vigilant. He also asked Ron to set up a swing in the yard for the boy, so he would have a place to play and not feel lonely. The butler promised to fulfill the request, thinking to himself that although the Duke seemed cold, he was actually very caring. The next day, guests arrived at the Duke Halo's castle. Chester stopped her and demanded she leave the child with him, although Victoria was sure the Duke was Leon's uncle. In a luxurious carriage, a blonde girl named Iris Henneron introduced herself to the Duke, giving a polite bow. Chester was surprised at how much she'd grown since the last time he saw her. Since back then she was a baby, and now she was 5 years old. Herman apologized for making the Duke wait so long, but he understood perfectly. The man was very happy to learn that Chester's long-lost nephew had finally appeared, and shared his joy with his daughter. Smiling, Chester noticed that Iris was very reserved, unlike how she had been as a child, and now resembled Sylvia. Without responding, Herman asked the Duke to allow the girl to explore the surroundings of the estate. Upon reaching the garden, Iris was fascinated by its beauty, the number of trees and the fountains. During the walk, she saw a swing, and Ron suggested she get on it. At first, the girl refused, saying that swings were only for little kids, realizing that due to her mother's illness, Iris acted like an adult. Ron started convincing her that swings weren't just for kids. The butler sat her on the swing. She was surprised by his request, knowing he still considered her a fraud. The child clung to the girl, crying loudly and trembling, and while she was swinging, the girl began to laugh happy. Suddenly, Leon appeared upset because an unknown person was using his swing. While having breakfast, Victoria reviewed all the documents related to her family's debts. She wanted to go to the bank with her mother, but her mother thanked her and said she could do it alone. Her parents assured her that they didn't want Victoria to overexert herself. Since she had been away from home for a long time, the girl thanked her parents for taking care of her and said goodbye to them. Once alone, she thought about how she hadn't managed to bring up the upcoming wedding. Supporting her head in her hands, she promised herself that when her parents returned, she would talk to them no matter what. In the meantime, Leon, grabbing the swing's rope, shook it angrily for the girl to get down. He was mad because she had already played on the swing, while he hadn't even been able to sit on it. T pulled Leon away, who was kicking, and explained to him that he couldn't act like that with guests. Iris got off the swing, saying she was done playing. She rejected Ron's suggestion to keep playing, explaining that the little one wanted to get on. Hearing this, Leon and Victoria refused to leave him in the castle. Chester insisted on his demand and promised that the reward would be paid without fail, turned red with rage and started yelling that he wasn't a little kid. However, Iris insisted and tried to show him that he was much smaller than her. Seeing that a fight was about to break out between the kids, T decided to take the boy back to the house. The maid suggested to Leon to go to the room to play with the star sphere. Upon hearing this, Iris advised the little one to go play with his toys as soon as possible. Leon, angry, dragged his foot hard and got the girl's shoes muddy. Iris's eyes filled with tears, and furious, she threw a handful of mud at Leon's face. In the next instant, after looking at each other for a few seconds, the kids lunged at each other and started fighting. Chester and Herman watched horrified as the kids were all dirty and angry at each other. Ron apologized to the Duke for not supervising them properly. The father leaned toward the girl and asked what was wrong. Iris complained that Leon had gotten her shoes dirty, that her mom was sick, and that they had to come to this mansion. The Duke looked sternly at Leon when they confirmed he was the right child. But Victoria couldn't do that, because as long as the Duke didn't recognize his nephew, to find out why he had used the mud, and the boy started trembling with fear. The nephew began to justify himself, saying he hadn't done anything wrong, that Iris was the first to get on the swing that the Duke had made for him, and that then he insulted the ball that Victoria had gifted him. Chester knew that Leon valued that ball like a treasure, and that he could really have gotten upset about it. Picking up the kid in his arms, he gave a few pats on the back to calm him down. While saying goodbye, Herman apologized for all the fuss. Even though they hadn't seen each other in a while, Chester replied that both kids had misbehaved and that there was no need to apologize. As Leon fell asleep, Herman promised that next time they would apologize, and the girl asked the Duke for forgiveness. Chester replied that Leon was also to blame, and that he would apologize to Iris as well. The friends finally said goodbye, and the Duke wished them a good trip. Remembering that Chester had talked about getting married, Herman congratulated him and advised him not to let the bride slip away. Hearing about the wedding from someone else, the Duke suddenly realized that he was actually going to get married. Chester was sitting in his office meeting one-on-one with those trying to sell him something. Some, for example, were proposing to invest in the mansion, others in the wine cellar, and others in a clothing store. Chester asked Ron for advice. The responsibility for the child remained hers. Leon ran happily into the girl's arms because he wanted to go home to his grandparents. On which of all the proposals was better, and he recommended thinking it over carefully before deciding. But at that moment, the Duke surprised the butler by saying he wasn't planning to invest. He was just choosing a gift for Victoria's parents. Laughing, Ron kicked all the sellers out the door, leaving Chester completely confused. The butler lunged at him, explaining that even a small sum of money from the Duke could make them uncomfortable. He explained to Chester that the news of the wedding was already too shocking, and the money could cause a real misunderstanding, but the Duke had no idea what he could gift Victoria's parents in that case. So the butler advised him to buy something small and simple. Chester spent all day thinking about what that gift could be. He couldn't sleep, mulling over the idea that the groom's family could come to hate him if he couldn't think of something. Just thinking about not pleasing them made the Duke's body start to shake. When Ron entered Chester's room in the morning, he found him already dressed and with dark circles under his eyes. The butler realized that his lord was very worried about the gift and feared he wouldn't be liked by Victoria's family. Ron was surprised that Chester was already ready. Chester and Victoria started arguing again, but a servant intervened and warned them that if she took the child, to go out since it was still too early for the meeting, but the Duke couldn't stay in the castle any longer. He felt he would go crazy from overthinking. So he decided to go out for a walk, buy the gift, and head to the groom's house. When he finished getting ready, he asked the butler if he looked good and received an affirmative answer. Ron sincerely wished Chester good luck and promised him that everything would go well. After receiving the butler's approval, the Duke thanked him and left the castle. Meanwhile, Victoria's parents, upon learning about the upcoming wedding, were shocked by what they heard. They couldn't calm down, since the girl had suddenly decided to get married, even though she didn't have a suitor. But Victoria asked them not to worry, ensuring she had thought it through and that the Duke was actually a good person. She was trying to convince her father that she was no longer a child and could get married. But the man refused to give her permission no matter how much Victoria tried to convince him. Seeing that she wasn't getting through to him, the girl reminded her father that he and her mother got married when they were both 20 years old. Still, arguing when the butler entered the room and announced that Duke Chester Halos had arrived, they would both be in danger. He informed them that unfortunately the Halos family had quite a few enemies. Victoria. Upon hearing this, Victoria ran out to meet the Duke, who had arrived 2 hours earlier than agreed. As she stepped outside, she closed her eyes, dazzled by his appearance, although she was mentally trying not to say anything. Victoria couldn't help but exclaim, captivated by his charm. At that moment, the Baroness appeared at the door and suggested to Chester that he enter the house. Seeing that the Duke was accompanied, the woman kindly invited them to come in. Rosalie remembered that she had forgotten to introduce herself to the Duke, and smiling hurried to correct her mistake. The Baroness went to fetch the father and asked Victoria to accompany the Duke to the living room. Once alone, the girl asked him why Chester had arrived so early. The Duke recalled how he had left home early to clear his mind and rest after a sleepless night. Then he went to a store to buy a gift for her parents. However, even after finishing his stroll, he still had a lot of time left, so while waiting with the carriage in front of the mansion, the butler suggested he go inside, fearing that by explaining, recalled that the book mentioned the Halos family had many rivals who committed all kinds of evils. This meant, all this, it would seem like he had nothing to do. The Duke lied, saying that another appointment had been canceled. Victoria explained to the Duke that everything was fine, only that she had chosen a rather inconvenient time to arrive. She confessed that she had just told her parents about the wedding, and that they immediately refused. Suddenly, the Duke moved much closer to the girl and gently hugged her, leaning towards her and bringing his hand to her cheek. Their hearts were racing, and Victoria didn't understand why he was so close. The girl abruptly pulled his hand away, feeling terribly uncomfortable. Chester explained to Victoria that she had turned red, that there was just a hair stuck on her face, and he wanted to remove it. The girl felt embarrassed about her own thoughts. But the Duke looked so amazing that she couldn't stop thinking about him. Victoria explained that she was looking at him like that because she was nervous about his arrival. The Duke thought it looked weird, but the girl, smiling, told him that that style suited him very well. Their conversation was interrupted by Victoria's father, the man Aiden Prosier, who entered the room with a serious face. They all sat in the living room facing each other, and the girl noticed how upset her father was, that if rumors spread about them and the child's safety would no longer be guaranteed. She hugged the child filled with doubts. The man's whole body was so tense that it seemed like he would never relax. Chester and Victoria's father stared at each other, exchanging polite phrases in low voices. The girl asked the Duke to do something to ease the tension. Because his wedding plans could fall apart, Chester cleared his throat and told the guy that he wasn't coming empty-handed for his first visit. But with a gift, he ordered the servants to bring the gift, and they placed 2 small boxes on the table. Upon opening them, the Duke said it was a small, heartfelt gift, and hoped it wouldn't be a burden for Victoria's parents. When the box opened, everyone was nearly blinded by the shine of the stones inside. On a velvet cushion were lined blue diamonds, sun tears, and also roses. Blessing of Chernicha Victoria had heard they were the most expensive stones in the world, and she was surprised that the Duke thought a gift like that didn't imply anything. The guy slammed the box shut and asked the Duke to take the gift and leave his house.